The wind howled through the cracks in the wooden walls of the hut, carrying with it the sharp scent of seaweed and salt spray. Harry Potter lay on the cold, damp floor, watching the luminous hands of Dudley's watch creep toward midnight. In just over an hour, he would be 11 years old, though he doubted anyone in this God-forsaken place would remember or care. Uncle Vernon's snores rumbled from the lumpy bed, where he and Aunt Petunia had squeezed themselves together, leaving Dudley the moth-eaten sofa. Harry's cousin sprawled across the sagging cushions, his mouth hanging open, occasional grunts escaping between his father's thunderous breathing. The storm outside seemed almost peaceful compared to the cacophony within the hut. Harry adjusted his broken glasses and pulled his thin jacket tighter around his shoulders. The floor beneath him felt like ice, and every gust of wind through the gaps in the walls sent new shivers down his spine. He had given up trying to sleep hours ago. His mind was too restless, too full of questions that seemed to multiply in the darkness. The letters had started arriving 3 days ago, hundreds of them, all addressed to him in emerald green ink, all bearing the same strange coat of arms. Uncle Vernon had grown increasingly frantic with each delivery, boarding up the letter slot, moving them to different hotels, and finally dragging them all the way out here to this miserable rock in the middle of nowhere, all to escape pieces of parchment. But why? What could possibly be so threatening about letters addressed to Harry Potter, the cupboard under the stairs, 4 Privet Drive? Uncle Vernon's face had turned an alarming shade of purple whenever Harry had tried to ask, and Aunt Petunia had only pursed her lips tighter, as if the very act of acknowledging the letters might bring some terrible catastrophe upon them all. Harry's fingers traced the rough wooden planks beside him, feeling the splinters and salt stains. Tomorrow was his birthday, his 11th birthday, and he would spend it trapped on this rock with people who seemed to hate his very existence. He had never received a birthday card, never had a proper birthday cake, never even been told the exact time he was born. For all he knew, he might already be 11. A fresh gust of wind rattled the windows, and Harry's gaze fell on Dudley's school bag, abandoned beside the sofa. His cousin had been forced to bring it along in Uncle Vernon's mad dash from the hotel, though Harry doubted Dudley had any intention of doing homework while hiding from mysterious letters. The bag's zipper was slightly open, and Harry could see the corner of an exercise book peeking out. An idea began to form in Harry's mind, so audacious it made his heart race. For 10 years, he had been invisible. The boy who lived under the stairs, as he sometimes thought of himself with bitter humor. No one knew he existed except the Dursleys, his teachers, and a handful of neighbors who occasionally saw him doing garden work. But someone, somewhere, knew enough to send him letters. Someone cared enough to track him down, even to this remote hut. What if he stopped being invisible? Harry glanced at his sleeping relatives, then carefully crawled across the floor toward Dudley's bag. His cousin stirred slightly, but didn't wake. Harry's fingers closed around the exercise book and a pen, and he retreated to the far corner of the hut, where the moonlight streaming through the grimy window provided just enough illumination to write. He opened the book to a blank page, his hand trembling slightly as he gripped the pen. What did he want to say? What did he want the world to know? The question seemed enormous in the dim light, but Harry forced himself to focus. He would start with the truth, or at least as much of the truth as he knew. "My name is Harry Potter," he wrote, the words looking stark and strange on the page. "I am writing this letter on July 30th, 1991, the night before my 11th birthday. I am told my parents died in a car crash when I was a baby, but I don't think that's the whole truth. For the past 10 years, I have lived with my aunt and uncle, Vernon and Petunia Dursley, and their son Dudley, at 4 Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey. Harry paused, listening to make sure his relatives were still asleep. Uncle Vernon's snoring continued unabated, and Dudley had rolled over but remained unconscious. Harry turned back to his letter, his resolve strengthening with each word. The Dursleys have never told me anything about my parents, except that they died drunk in a car crash, which left me with this scar. Harry touched the lightning bolt-shaped mark on his forehead absently. They have kept me locked in a cupboard under the stairs for most of my life, fed me scraps, and made me do all the household work while they spoiled their own son. They have told everyone that I go to St. Brutus's secure centre for incurably criminal boys, when in fact I attend Stonewall High School. The wind picked up outside, and something metallic rattled against the roof. Harry flinched at the sound, then continued writing. There was no going back now. 3 days ago, letters started arriving for me. Hundreds of them. The Dursleys became terrified and have dragged me to increasingly remote locations to escape these letters, as if pieces of parchment were some kind of terrible threat. We are currently hiding in a hut built on a rock in the sea, and they have boarded up our house on Privet Drive. I don't understand what they're so afraid of, but their fear tells me that these letters, and whatever they represent, might be the key to understanding who I really am. Harry's hand was beginning to cramp, but he pressed on. This might be his only chance to tell his story, to make someone listen. I have lived my entire life being told I was a burden, a freak, an unwanted reminder of my parents' abnormality. But if someone out there is trying to contact me, if someone thinks I'm worth finding, then maybe the Dursleys have been lying about more than just the car crash. Maybe there are people who knew my parents, who could tell me the truth about how they really died, and why I was left with relatives who despise me. The moonlight shifted as clouds passed overhead, casting the hut into deeper shadow for a moment before returning. Harry squinted at his writing, making sure he could still read his own handwriting. I don't know if anyone will believe this letter, or if anyone will care. But I am tired of being invisible, tired of being told I don't matter, tired of living in a cupboard while questions about my parents and my past pile up like those mysterious letters the Dursleys are so desperate to escape. My name is Harry Potter. I am 11 years old as of midnight tonight. I live at 4 Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey, with relatives who would probably prefer I didn't exist. If you are reading this, it means someone finally listened. Harry signed his name at the bottom with a flourish, then stared at what he had written. It felt like the most honest thing he had ever put on paper, and also the most terrifying. He was about to make himself known to the world, to step out of the shadows the Dursleys had kept him in for so long. But how could he send it? He had no way to post letters from this isolated rock, no money for stamps even if he could reach a post office. Harry chewed his lip, thinking hard. Then his eyes fell on Dudley's bag again, and he remembered seeing a list of addresses in one of his cousin's notebooks, research for a school project about British newspapers. Moving as quietly as possible, Harry retrieved the notebook and flipped through it until he found the page he remembered. There, in Dudley's messy handwriting, were the addresses of a dozen major newspapers: The Times, The Guardian, The Daily Telegraph, The Independent, and several others. Harry carefully copied each address onto separate sheets of paper, then wrote out his letter 11 more times, his hand aching by the time he finished. The clock was approaching 1:45 now. Harry folded each letter carefully and addressed it to the editor at each newspaper. He had no envelopes, no stamps, and no rational plan for how these letters would reach their destinations. But as he sat in the dim light of the hut, surrounded by sleeping Dursleys and the sound of wind and waves, something strange began to happen. Harry had always been able to make odd things occur when he was particularly upset or desperate. Glass had vanished from zoo enclosures. He had somehow appeared on school rooftops when running from Dudley's gang, and Aunt Petunia's pudding had once exploded when she was being particularly cruel about his parents. The Dursleys had always blamed these incidents on his freakishness, but Harry had never been able to control or understand them. Now, as he held the stack of letters and wished desperately that they would find their way to people who might listen, he felt that familiar tingling sensation building in his chest. The air around him seemed to shimmer slightly, and the letters in his hands grew warm. Harry closed his eyes and concentrated on his wish with all the intensity he could muster. He pictured the letters flying through the night, finding their way to newspaper offices across Britain, landing on editors' desks where they would be read and believed and acted upon. He imagined journalists investigating his story, Uncle Vernon's face when reporters showed up at Privet Drive, the truth finally coming to light after 10 years of lies and cupboards and forced invisibility. When he opened his eyes, the letters were gone. Harry blinked, looking around the hut in confusion. The folded pieces of paper had simply vanished from his hands, leaving only a faint warmth on his palms and the lingering scent of something that might have been ozone. He checked the floor around him, wondering if they had fallen, but found nothing. Outside, the storm seemed to be calming, and Harry could see the first faint hints of dawn on the horizon. His watch showed 5 minutes to midnight. In 5 minutes, he would be 11 years old. And somewhere out there, if his impossible hope had become reality, 12 letters bearing his name and his truth were making their way to people who might finally listen. Harry settled back against the wall of the hut, pulling his jacket around him once more. He was cold, hungry, and exhausted, but for the first time in his life, he also felt something else: hope. Whatever happened next, whatever those mysterious green letters had been about, whatever the Dursleys were so afraid of, Harry Potter was no longer invisible. The watch ticked over to midnight, and Harry Potter turned 11 years old in a hut on a rock in the sea, having just sent his story to the world in the most impossible way imaginable. Tomorrow would bring consequences he couldn't yet foresee, but tonight, as he finally drifted off to sleep on the cold floor, Harry smiled. He had spent 10 years being nobody. As of today, that was going to change. Harry was jolted awake by a tremendous bang on the door of the hut. The sound reverberated through the small wooden structure like thunder, causing Uncle Vernon to leap from the bed with a strangled yelp, and Aunt Petunia to emit a shriek that could have woken the dead. Dudley tumbled from the sofa with a crash, his eyes wide with terror. "Where's the cannon?" Uncle Vernon shouted, looking wildly around the hut. Another tremendous boom echoed from the door, and this time the hinges creaked ominously under the force of whatever was trying to get in. Harry scrambled to his feet, his heart pounding. He checked Dudley's watch, which was still strapped to his cousin's wrist. The luminous hands showed exactly midnight. His birthday. Whatever was outside had arrived at the precise moment he turned 11. Boom! The door burst open with such violence that it flew clean off its hinges and crashed to the floor with a resounding clatter. In the doorway stood the most enormous man Harry had ever seen. He was easily twice the height of a normal person, with long, tangled black hair and a wild beard that covered most of his face. His black eyes glittered in the moonlight as he stepped into the hut, having to duck considerably to avoid hitting his head on the low ceiling. "Sorry about that," the giant said, in a voice like distant thunder. He picked up the door and fitted it back into its frame, though it hung crooked now. "Couldn't make you hear me." Uncle Vernon had pressed himself against the far wall, his face the color of old cheese. Aunt Petunia was making small squeaking sounds, and Dudley had crawled behind the sofa. Only Harry remained standing, staring up at this impossible visitor, with a mixture of wonder and recognition he couldn't quite place. The giant's gaze swept the hut until it found Harry, and then his craggy face split into an enormous grin. "Harry, blimey, Harry, how you've grown! Last time I saw you, you was only a baby. You look terrible like your dad, but you've got your mum's eyes." Harry's mouth fell open. This stranger knew his parents, actually knew them, could compare Harry to them from memory. "Who are you?" Harry managed to whisper. "Rubeus Hagrid, keeper of keys and grounds at Hogwarts," the giant said, extending a massive hand that could have easily covered Harry's entire head. "Course you'll know all about Hogwarts." "No," Harry said honestly. "I don't know anything about Hogwarts. I don't know anything about anything, really." Hagrid's face darkened, and he turned to look at the cowering Dursleys with an expression of growing anger. "You mean to tell me that this boy don't know about his own story? About where he came from? About what happened to his parents?" "We told him they died in a car crash," Aunt Petunia said, in a voice barely above a whisper. "Car crash!" Hagrid's roar shook the entire hut. "How could a car crash kill Lily and James Potter? It's an outrage, a scandal. Harry Potter not knowing his own story when every kid in our world knows his name." "Our world?" Harry asked, stepping closer to Hagrid despite the man's intimidating size. Something about him felt safe, felt right in a way the Dursleys never had. Hagrid looked down at Harry, his expression softening. "The wizarding world, Harry. You're a wizard, just like your mum and dad. And a famous one, too, though I see these muggles haven't told you that either." "A wizard," Harry repeated, the word feeling strange on his tongue. "But that's impossible. Magic isn't real." "Not real?" Hagrid laughed, a booming sound that filled the hut. "Harry, what do you think's been happening when strange things occur around you? When you've made things happen when you were angry or scared?" Harry's mouth went dry. How could this stranger know about the glass at the zoo, about appearing on the school roof, about all the odd incidents the Dursleys had blamed on his freakishness? "I've got your letter right here," Hagrid said, reaching into his massive coat. He pulled out an envelope made of thick, yellowish parchment with emerald green writing on it. "Harry Potter, the hut on the rock, the sea." Course I didn't need the address. Been tracking you for the last 3 days, ever since these fools started running from their own shadows. Harry took the letter with trembling hands, but before he could open it, a new sound cut through the night air. It was a strange rushing noise, like wind, but somehow more purposeful. Hagrid's head snapped up, his eyes widening. "What in Merlin's name?" he muttered, stepping toward the window. The rushing sound grew louder, and then suddenly the air outside the hut was filled with wings. Dozens of owls, appearing as dark shapes against the starlit sky, were circling the rock where the hut stood. But these weren't the only birds. Mixed in with the owls were ravens, hawks, and even a few eagles, all carrying something in their talons. As Harry watched in amazement, the birds began landing on the roof, the window ledges, and every available surface around the hut. "Post owls," Hagrid said, his voice full of confusion. "But why so many? And why here?" One of the owls, a magnificent, tawny creature with intelligent amber eyes, tapped on the window with its beak. Hagrid opened the window, and the owl swooped in, dropping a rolled parchment at his feet before flying back out into the night. Hagrid unrolled the parchment, and his face went pale beneath his wild beard. "This is from the Ministry," he said slowly. "Emergency communication. They want me to report to London immediately with Harry Potter." He looked up from the letter, his black eyes confused and worried. "But how did they know I was here? I only just arrived and—" Another owl flew in, this one carrying what looked like a newspaper. It dropped the paper on the floor and flew out again. Harry could see the masthead clearly in the moonlight. The Times. "That's a Muggle newspaper," Harry said, pointing. Hagrid picked up the paper, and his eyes widened as he saw the front page. "Blimey," he breathed. "Harry, have you seen this?" He held up the newspaper, and Harry felt his heart stop. There, on the front page of one of Britain's most respected newspapers, was a large headline. "Mysterious letter claims boy lived in cupboard for 10 years. Below it was a smaller subheading. Anonymous letter signed Harry Potter describes abuse, mysterious letters, and family cover-up. "I don't understand," Hagrid said, looking between the newspaper and Harry. "How did they get this story? Who told them about—" "I did," Harry said quietly. The hut fell completely silent, except for the sound of Uncle Vernon's laboured breathing and the rustle of owl wings outside. "You did what?" Hagrid asked, his voice very quiet. "Last night, I wrote letters to 12 newspapers. I told them about living with the Dursleys, about the mysterious letters, about everything." Harry met Hagrid's eyes, trying to read the expression on the giant's face. "I didn't know about magic then. I just wanted someone to listen. Someone to know I existed." Hagrid stared at him for a long moment, then looked back at the newspaper. "Harry," he said slowly, "do you understand what you've done?" Before Harry could answer, another owl burst through the window, this one carrying a newspaper with a very different masthead. This paper seemed to glow with its own light, and the photographs on the front page were moving. Harry watched in fascination as a small image of a wizard in a pointed hat waved at him from the page. "The Daily Prophet," Hagrid said grimly, taking the wizarding newspaper. His face went from pale to green as he read the headline, "Boy Who Lived Reveals Abuse to Muggle World. Ministry in Crisis." The article below was extensive, and Harry could see his own words quoted throughout it. The letter he had written now reproduced for the entire wizarding world to read. But there was more. The newspaper had somehow gotten additional information, details about Harry's parents that he had never known, about something called the First Wizarding War, and about his defeat of someone called You-Know-Who. "Hagrid," Harry said, his voice shaking, "what is the boy who lived? What did I do?" Hagrid sat heavily on the broken sofa, which creaked alarmingly under his weight. He looked older suddenly, the weight of some terrible responsibility settling on his shoulders. "Harry," he said quietly, "I think I need to tell you a story. But first—" He looked around at the owls still arriving outside. "First, I think we need to understand just how big this has become." As if summoned by his words, a magnificent barn owl swept through the window, carrying an official-looking letter sealed with red wax. Hagrid opened it with shaking hands, and his face went completely white. "It's from Cornelius Fudge," he said, "the Minister for Magic himself. He wants to see us both in London. Now. Tonight." Hagrid looked up at Harry, his black eyes full of worry. "Harry, I think you may have just changed everything. The whole wizarding world is in an uproar, and it's all because of those letters you sent." Uncle Vernon chose that moment to find his voice. "Now see here," he blustered, stepping forward with his face purple with rage. "I don't know what sort of freakish nonsense this is, but the boy is not going anywhere with you." Hagrid stood slowly, rising to his full impressive height. The temperature in the hut seemed to drop several degrees as he looked down at Uncle Vernon. "I don't think," he said in a voice like distant thunder, "that ye have any say in the matter any more, Vernon Dursley. Not after what the whole world has just learned about how you've been treating Harry." Outside, more owls were arriving. and Harry could see lights appearing in the distance. Boats, perhaps, or helicopters. The letter he had written in desperation, just hours before, had set something in motion, something that was rapidly spiraling beyond anyone's control. "What have I done?" Harry whispered, staring at the moving photographs in the Daily Prophet. "I don't know, Harry," Hagrid said honestly, looking around at the chaos that was beginning to unfold. "But I think we'd better get to London and find out." The watch on Dudley's wrist showed 12:30 in the morning. Harry Potter was 30 minutes into being 11 years old, and his life had already changed beyond all recognition. The world knew his name, both the magical and non-magical parts of it, and somewhere in London, the most powerful wizards in Britain were scrambling to deal with the crisis he had accidentally unleashed. As Hagrid gathered up the letters and newspapers, preparing to somehow transport them both to London, Harry couldn't help but think that this was not how he had imagined his first few minutes as an 11-year-old would go. He had wanted someone to listen to his story. He had never imagined that everyone would be listening at once. The emergency flu call reached Cornelius Fudge at precisely 12:47 in the morning, jolting the Minister for Magic from a sound sleep in his London flat. The green flames in his bedroom fireplace blazed to life, and the head of his personal secretary appeared in the grate, her face flushed with panic. "Minister," she gasped, "you need to come to the ministry immediately. We have a situation." "What sort of situation?" Fudge asked, fumbling for his spectacles and lime-green bowler hat. As minister, he was accustomed to late-night emergencies, but something in his secretary's voice suggested this was different. "It's the Potter boy, sir. Harry Potter. He's told the Muggles everything." Fudge's blood went cold. "What do you mean, everything?" "The newspapers, sir. Both ours and theirs. Letters about his life with the Muggles, about mysterious correspondence he's been receiving. The Daily Prophet has connected it to you-know-who, and the Muggle papers are asking questions about his parents' deaths and why a boy has been kept in a cupboard for 10 years. Fudge was already reaching for his travelling cloak. "Assemble the emergency council. Get me Amelia Bones, Arthur Weasley from Misuse of Muggle Artifacts, and someone from the Obliviator Department. I'll be there in 5 minutes." By the time Fudge arrived at the Ministry of Magic through the visitors' entrance, the normally quiet corridors were buzzing with activity despite the early hour. Officials hurried past with armfuls of newspapers, both wizarding and Muggle, their faces grim. The golden fountain in the main atrium had been surrounded by a cluster of witches and wizards, all talking in hushed, urgent tones. "Minister," called a voice from across the atrium. Kingsley Shacklebolt, a senior Auror, was striding toward him with a stack of newspapers under his arm. "We need to talk immediately." "How bad is it?" Fudge asked, as they stepped into the golden grille of the ministry lift. "Bad," Kingsley said grimly. "The Muggle papers hit the streets 2 hours ago. The Times, the Guardian, the Daily Telegraph, the Independent, all the major ones. They're all running the story on their front pages. Questions are being asked in Parliament. The Prime Minister's office has already received inquiries, and Muggle Social Services are investigating the address on Privet Drive." The lift jerked to a stop on level 2, and Fudge hurried toward his office, his mind racing. "What about our side?" The Daily Prophet ran a special emergency edition. Unfortunately, instead of containing the situation, they've made it worse. They've confirmed details about Potter's defeat of you-know-who, provided background about the war, and essentially told the entire wizarding world that the boy who lived has been living in abuse for the past 10 years. Fudge's office was already crowded when he arrived. Amelia Bones, head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, stood near his desk with several thick files spread before her. Arthur Weasley from the Misuse of Muggle Artifacts office was pacing near the window, his red hair dishevelled. A witch Fudge didn't recognize was seated in the corner, presumably from the Obliviator department. "Report," Fudge said without preamble, settling behind his desk. "Minister," Amelia Bones began, "we have a potential, complete breach of the International Statute of Secrecy. Young Potter's letter has revealed the existence of the wizarding world to millions of muggles. While he didn't explicitly mention magic in his correspondence, the follow-up coverage in the Daily Prophet has made connections that any intelligent muggle could piece together." "What exactly did he say?" Fudge asked, though he dreaded the answer. Arthur Weasley picked up one of the muggle newspapers. He described mysterious letters arriving for him, his relatives' terror of these letters, and their flight to increasingly remote locations. He mentioned being told his parents died in a car crash, but expressed doubt about this explanation. The Muggle papers are calling it a potential cover-up involving family abuse and possible murder. "Murder?" Fudge's voice pitched higher. "The Muggles don't understand about you-know-who," the Obliviator representative spoke for the first time. "They're interpreting the inconsistencies in Potter's story as evidence of a more conventional crime. Some papers are suggesting his parents were murdered by criminals, and that the Dursleys have been covering it up to protect themselves or others." Fudge buried his head in his hands. "How many newspapers?" "In Britain alone? 12 major publications, both broadsheet and tabloid." "But Minister," Arthur Weasley said gently, "it's spreading. We've had reports of wire services picking up the story. It's going international." "What about Hagrid?" Fudge asked. "He was supposed to bring Potter to London quietly." "He's en route," Amelia Bones reported. "But, sir, bringing Potter here now might not be wise. The Muggle authorities are already looking for him. Social services, the police, possibly even intelligence agencies, given the unusual nature of the story." Fudge stood and began pacing behind his desk. In all his years as minister, he had never faced a crisis quite like this. The statute of secrecy had been breached before, but usually in isolated incidents affecting small numbers of Muggles who could be easily obliviated. This was different. This was public, documented, and spreading beyond their ability to contain through normal channels. "What about damage control?" he asked. "I've already initiated Operation Befuddlement," the Obliviator said. "Teams are being deployed to the major newspaper offices as we speak. However, Minister, the sheer volume of copies already in circulation makes complete obliviation impossible. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of newspapers across the country, possibly millions if you include online versions." "Online?" Fudge looked confused. "Muggle computer networks, sir," Arthur Weasley explained. "The story is spreading through their electronic communication systems faster than we can track it." "Then what do you suggest?" Amelia Bones leaned forward. "We need to discredit the story from multiple angles. First, we need the Daily Prophet to publish a retraction, suggesting they were hoaxed. Second, we need influential figures in the Muggle world to dismiss the story as a fabrication. And third, we need to make sure Harry Potter himself recants his claims." "The boy is 11 years old," Fudge protested. "How exactly do we convince him to lie about his own life?" "That's where alternative approaches might be necessary," a new voice said from the doorway. Everyone turned to see a tall, pale man with long, white blonde hair entering the office. His cold grey eyes surveyed the room with calculated precision. "Lucius," Fudge said, relief evident in his voice. "I was hoping you'd come." Lucius Malfoy closed the door behind him and moved gracefully to the center of the room. At 37, he carried himself with the confidence of a man accustomed to wielding power behind the scenes. His expensive robes were immaculate despite the early hour, suggesting he had been expecting this summons. "Minister," Lucius said with a slight bow, "I came as soon as I received your message. I understand we have a situation that requires—" delicate handling. "The Potter boy has compromised everything," Fudge said. "We need solutions, and we need them now. May I?" Lucius gestured toward the newspapers scattered across the desk. He picked up a copy of the Times and scanned the front page, his expression unreadable. "Interesting. The boy shows more initiative than I would have credited him with. However, this presents opportunities as well as problems." "Opportunities?" Arthur Weasley asked, his tone skeptical. Lucius's lips curved in a cold smile. "Consider the narrative from the Muggle perspective. A disturbed child, raised in abusive circumstances, creates elaborate fantasies about mysterious letters and deceased parents. With the right pressure applied in the right places, this becomes a story about mental illness rather than magical conspiracy." "You're suggesting we paint Harry Potter as mentally unstable?" Amelia Bones looked appalled. "I'm suggesting we give the Muggles a rational explanation for irrational claims," Lucius corrected smoothly. "Meanwhile, our people can work to ensure that certain influential figures in the Muggle government understand the importance of treating this as a domestic abuse case rather than something requiring broader investigation." Fudge nodded slowly. "It wasn't ideal, but it might work." "What about our own people? The wizarding community will want answers." "The Daily Prophet will publish exactly what we tell them to publish," Lucius said with confidence. "A story of tragic miscommunication, perhaps. The boy was traumatized by his experiences and confused about the nature of his parents' deaths. The ministry, in its wisdom, is providing him with proper care and counseling." "And if he contradicts that story?" Lucius was quiet for a moment, his grey eyes thoughtful. "Children can be influenced, Minister, especially children who have been isolated and are desperate for acceptance and belonging. A few kind words from the right people, a sense of finally being wanted and important, and young Potter might be surprisingly cooperative in correcting his earlier misstatements." The room fell silent as everyone considered the implications of Lucius's words. Finally, Fudge spoke. "Very well. Lucius, I want you to coordinate with our people at the Daily Prophet. Arthur, work with the Obliviator teams to focus on the key Muggle publications. Amelia, reach out to our contacts in the Muggle government, discreetly. Frame this as a sensitive child welfare case that requires careful handling." "What about Potter himself?" Arthur asked. "Hagrid will bring him here," Fudge decided. "We'll evaluate the situation then. If he can be reasoned with, excellent. If not," he glanced at Lucius, "we'll explore other options." As the meeting began to disperse, Lucius lingered behind. "Minister," he said quietly, "there's something else you should consider. This incident has demonstrated a significant gap in our monitoring of young wizards. Potter was able to perform accidental magic powerful enough to transport letters across the country without any detection from our systems. That suggests either a concerning oversight in our surveillance or abilities in the boy that we haven't properly assessed." "What are you suggesting?" "That this crisis, unfortunate as it is, might also be an opportunity to ensure that Harry Potter receives the proper guidance he clearly needs. The wizarding world has expectations of the boy who lived. Perhaps it's time we began preparing him to meet them." Fudge nodded grimly. Outside his office window, the first light of dawn was beginning to creep across the London skyline. In a few hours, the Muggle world would wake to a story that challenged everything they thought they knew about reality. The wizarding world was already in an uproar, demanding explanations and action. And somewhere between these two worlds, an 11-year-old boy who just wanted someone to listen to his story had accidentally started a crisis that would reshape everything. The journey back to Privet Drive passed in a blur of impossible transportation and whispered explanations that left Harry's head spinning. Hagrid had somehow arranged for them all to travel by what he called official ministry transport, which turned out to be a large midnight blue car that flew through the early morning sky while remaining completely invisible to the muggles below. Uncle Vernon had spent the entire trip pressed against his seat, with his eyes squeezed shut, muttering about unnatural freakishness under his breath. Aunt Petunia sat rigid and silent, her thin hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. Dudley, meanwhile, had watched the countryside pass beneath them with something that might have been wonder if Harry hadn't known his cousin better. "They'll be waiting for us," Hagrid said as they began their descent toward Little Whinging. His massive frame filled most of the front seat, and his voice carried a note of grim resignation. "Ministries had people watching the house since the story broke. Can't have reporters or curious muggles poking around where they shouldn't." "What kind of people?" Harry asked, peering down at the familiar suburban streets through the car window. Even from this height, he could see that Privet Drive looked different. There were more cars parked along the street than usual, and he thought he could make out figures standing near the front gardens of several houses. "Official types," Hagrid said vaguely. "People who need to understand what's been happening here. How you've been living." Uncle Vernon's face, already pale from the flight, took on a distinctly greenish tinge. "Now, see here," he began, his voice pitched higher than usual. "Whatever that boy has told people, whatever lies he's spread, we've done nothing wrong. We took him in when no one else would. We fed him, clothed him, gave him a roof over his head." "A cupboard," Harry said quietly, surprised by his own boldness. "You gave me a cupboard under the stairs." It was a perfectly adequate space for a child. Aunt Petunia spoke for the first time since leaving the hut, her voice thin and defensive. "We didn't have to take you in at all. We could have left you at an orphanage." Hagrid turned in his seat to look back at the Dursleys, and his black eyes held an expression that made Uncle Vernon shrink back against the window. "No," he said, his voice very quiet and very dangerous. "You couldn't have. There were reasons Harry had to live here. Magical protections that required him to be with blood family. You knew this. You were told this. And you still chose to treat him like something ye scraped off your shoe." The car touched down on Privet Drive with the gentlest of bumps, settling onto the tarmac as naturally as if it had always been a perfectly ordinary vehicle. The moment the engine stopped, Harry could see the situation clearly. There were indeed more cars than usual lining the street, some bearing official government plates. Several men and women in dark robes stood at intervals along the pavement, and Harry was startled to recognize the tall figure of the Auror who had been in Minister Fudge's office earlier. "Kingsley Shacklebolt," Hagrid muttered, following Harry's gaze. "Good man. Bit serious, but reliable." At number 4 itself, the situation was even more dramatic. The boarded-up windows and door that Uncle Vernon had installed in his desperate attempt to keep out the Hogwarts letters had been removed, and the front garden was occupied by a small cluster of official-looking people. Some wore the dark robes Harry was beginning to associate with the magical world, while others were dressed in ordinary Muggle business attire. As they climbed out of the car, one of the robed figures approached them. She was a middle-aged witch with greying hair pulled back in a severe bun and an expression of barely controlled anger. "Mr. Hagrid," she said with a curt nod, "I'm Auror Proudfoot. We've been waiting for you." Her gaze shifted to Harry, and her expression softened slightly. "Mr. Potter, I'm very glad to see you safe." "This is all highly irregular," Uncle Vernon blustered, but his protests died in his throat as Auror Proudfoot fixed him with a stare that could have frozen fire. "Mr. Dursley," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I suggest you and your family go inside. We have a great deal to discuss." The interior of number 4 Privet Drive had been transformed. The usually pristine living room was crowded with officials, both magical and non-magical, and the air hummed with tension. Harry noticed several people with notebooks and official-looking clipboards, and one woman who was taking photographs of the cupboard under the stairs. The small door stood open, revealing the cramped space where Harry had spent so much of his childhood, and the sight of strangers examining it made his cheeks burn with a mixture of shame and vindication. "Harry Potter!" A kind-faced woman in muggle clothing approached him with a gentle smile. "My name is Mrs. Henderson. I'm with Surrey Social Services. We'd like to talk to you about your living arrangements here." Before Harry could respond, Hagrid's massive hand settled protectively on his shoulder. "The boy's been through enough today," he said firmly. "He needs to understand what's happening before anyone starts asking him more questions." "Of course," Mrs. Henderson said quickly. "I didn't mean to pressure him. It's just that his letter has raised some very serious concerns about his welfare." Hagrid nodded grimly. "As it should have." "Harry, why don't you sit down? I think it's time someone explained things properly." Harry sank into one of the Dursleys' pristine armchairs, acutely aware that this was probably the first time he had ever been allowed to sit on the good furniture. Dudley hovered uncertainly near the doorway, clearly wanting to flee but too fascinated by the proceedings to leave. Uncle Vernon and Aunt Petunia stood by the mantelpiece, looking like defendants awaiting sentencing. "The first thing you need to understand, Harry," Hagrid began, settling his enormous frame onto the sofa with a creak of protest from the springs, "is why you had to live here. It wasn't just because the Dursleys were your only living relatives. There was magic involved. Powerful magic." "What kind of magic?" Harry asked, leaning forward with interest. Hagrid glanced at Aura Proudfoot, who nodded encouragingly. "When your mum died protecting you from you-know-who, she created a protection around you, a protection based on love and sacrifice, the most powerful magic there is. But that protection only worked if you lived with someone who shared her blood." "Aunt Petunia," Harry said, understanding beginning to dawn. "That's right. As long as you could call this place home, as long as there was someone here who was related to your mum by blood, the protection would keep you safe from you-know-who and his followers." Hagrid's expression grew dark. "Course, that protection was never meant to excuse treating you badly. You should have been loved and cared for, made to feel welcome and wanted." Aunt Petunia made a sound somewhere between a sob and a protest. "We didn't know how," she said, in a voice barely above a whisper. "We didn't know how to cope with what he was, what he represented." "You knew he was just a child," Hagrid said sharply, "a child who'd lost his parents and needed care and kindness." "His parents?" Uncle Vernon spat, seeming to find his courage again. "You mean those freaks who got themselves blown up by another freak? We told him they died in a car crash. It was kinder than the truth." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Hagrid rose slowly to his feet, his face thunderous. "Car crash," he repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. "You told him his parents died in a car crash?" "It's what we agreed to tell him," Aunt Petunia said quickly, shooting a nervous glance at her husband. "Dumbledore said we should tell him when he was old enough to understand. But he never came back. Year after year, no one came to check on him or tell us what to say. So you let him grow up thinking his parents were drunken layabouts who got themselves killed." Hagrid's voice was rising now, and several of the officials stepped closer, clearly concerned about his growing anger. "That's enough," Aura Proudfoot interjected firmly. "Mr. Hagrid, Perhaps you could tell Harry about his parents properly. Mr. and Mrs. Dursley, I think you should speak with our colleagues from social services." As the Dursleys were led away to another room, Hagrid sat back down heavily and turned to Harry with an expression of infinite sadness. "I'm sorry, Harry. I'm so sorry you weren't told the truth sooner." "What is the truth?" Harry asked quietly. "Your parents were heroes," Hagrid said simply. "James and Lily Potter. They fought against the darkest wizard of our time, a monster who called himself Lord Voldemort. Most people are too scared to say his name, call him you-know-who or he who must not be named. But your parents stood up to him, fought him when others ran and hid." Harry felt something tight in his chest begin to loosen. "They were brave?" "The bravest. Your dad, James, was born on March 27th, 1960. He was a brilliant wizard, good at everything he tried. Quidditch, transfiguration, making people laugh. He could be a bit of a show-off when he was young, but he had a good heart." Hagrid's eyes grew distant with memory. "Your mum, Lily, she was born on January 30th of the same year. Muggle-born she was, but one of the most talented witches of her generation. Kind, clever, fierce when she needed to be. They both had their whole lives ahead of them." "What happened to them?" Hagrid's massive hands clenched into fists. "October 31st, 1981. You-know-who found out where you were hiding. He came to Godric's Hollow, where you lived with your parents. He killed your dad first, trying to get to you and your mum. Then he killed your mum when she wouldn't step aside." Hagrid's voice grew thick with emotion. "But when he tried to kill you, Harry, something went wrong. The curse that should have killed you bounced back on him, destroyed his body, sent him fleeing like a shadow. And you survived with nothing but that scar." Harry touched the lightning bolt mark on his forehead, understanding flooding through him. "That's why I'm famous. That's why people know my name. You're the boy who lived, Harry, the only person to survive the killing curse. You saved the wizarding world when you were just a baby, by surviving when you should have died." The room was very quiet now, the weight of this revelation settling over everyone present. Harry looked around at the officials, at the photographs being taken of his cupboard, at the evidence of the life he had lived while carrying this incredible history without knowing it. "I need to take you to Diagon Alley now," Hagrid said gently. "You'll need your school things for Hogwarts. And after everything that's happened today, I think you need to see the world that's been waiting for you." "What about them?" Harry gestured toward the room where the Dursleys had been taken. "They'll face consequences for how they treated you," Aura Proudfoot said firmly. "But Harry, that's not your concern anymore. You have a new life waiting for you now. A life where you'll be valued and protected, and taught everything you need to know about who you really are." As they prepared to leave number 4 Privet Drive, Harry took one last look at the cupboard under the stairs. For 10 years it had been his world, his prison, the place where he had dreamed of something better without ever daring to hope it might be real. Now, as he walked toward the front door with Hagrid's protective bulk beside him, and officials ensuring he would never have to return to that dark, cramped space, Harry Potter finally understood that his real life was just beginning. The blood protection that had kept him alive would always connect him to this place, but it would no longer define him. He was Harry Potter, son of James and Lily, the boy who lived, and he was finally going home to the world where he belonged. The entrance to Diagon Alley had never seen anything quite like the scene that greeted Harry and Hagrid when they arrived at the Leaky Cauldron. What should have been a routine shopping trip for school supplies had transformed into something resembling a state visit, complete with ministry security and a crowd of onlookers that seemed to grow larger by the minute. Blimey, Hagrid muttered, as they approached the shabby pub that served as the gateway to the wizarding shopping district. Never seen so many people here on a weekday morning. 3 auras in dark robes flanked the entrance to the pub, their wands held at the ready and their faces professionally alert. Behind them, Harry could see a crowd of witches and wizards pressed against the windows, all straining to catch a glimpse of something or someone inside. The Daily Prophet photographer was easy to spot, his magical camera releasing small puffs of purple smoke with each flash, while several other people who looked like reporters scribbled frantically on self-writing quills. "Mr. Potter?" One of the auras stepped forward as they approached. "I'm Aura Dawlish. We'll be escorting you through Diagon Alley today for your safety." "Is all this really necessary?" Harry asked, feeling overwhelmed by the attention. Through the grimy windows of the leaky cauldron, he could see even more people inside, all craning their necks toward the entrance. "I'm afraid so," Dawlish replied grimly. "Word spread quickly about your situation. The entire wizarding community is talking about what happened to you, and everyone wants to see the boy who lived for themselves. Some are just curious, but we can't take any chances." Hagrid placed a protective hand on Harry's shoulder. "Don't worry, Harry. We'll get you sorted quickly and get out of here." The moment they stepped inside the leaky cauldron, the pub fell silent. Every conversation stopped. Every glass paused halfway to its owner's lips, and every eye in the room fixed on Harry. He could feel his cheeks burning under the scrutiny, acutely aware of his second-hand clothes and broken glasses in the face of such intense attention. Then, as if released from a spell, the entire pub erupted into motion. Chairs scraped against the floor as people leaped to their feet, voices rose in excitement, and several people began pushing forward through the crowd. "Harry Potter! Is it really him? Poor dear, look how thin he is. The Daily Prophet said he was kept in a cupboard. Disgraceful how those muggles treated him. Harry, could I shake your hand?" The crowd pressed closer, and Harry instinctively stepped backward, bumping into Hagrid's solid bulk. The giant gamekeeper immediately moved to shield Harry from the advancing people, his face set in determined lines. "Stand back!" Aura Dawlish commanded, his wand now clearly visible. "Give the boy some space." "We just want to welcome him properly," called out a witch with kind eyes and greying hair. "The poor child's been through enough." "He certainly has," agreed another voice from the crowd. 11 years with those awful muggles, and we never knew." Harry felt a mixture of warmth and embarrassment at the obvious sympathy in their voices. These people genuinely seemed to care about what had happened to him, but the intensity of their attention was almost overwhelming. "Right then," Hagrid announced loudly. "We need to get through to Diagon Alley. Harry's got shopping to do for school." Tom the barkeeper, a toothless old man who looked like he had been part of the pub's fixtures for decades, quickly cleared a path to the back courtyard. "This way, Mr. Potter," he said, with a respectful bow that made Harry feel even more uncomfortable. "It's an honor to have you in my establishment." The courtyard behind the leaky cauldron was mercifully empty, except for the 2 additional auras stationed by the brick wall. Harry watched in fascination as Hagrid tapped the bricks in a specific sequence with his umbrella, causing them to shift and rearrange themselves into an archway that revealed the most extraordinary street Harry had ever seen. Diagon Alley stretched before them like something from a fairy tale, all crooked buildings and magical shop signs that moved and glittered in the morning sunlight. But today, the usually bustling street was even more crowded than normal. Word of Harry Potter's shopping trip had clearly spread, and it seemed like half the wizarding population of London had decided to visit Diagon Alley at the same time. "Stay close," Aura Dawlish instructed as they stepped through the archway. We'll escort you to Gringotts first. The white marble building of Gringotts Bank stood tall at the end of the street, its bronze doors gleaming in the sunlight. Even from a distance, Harry could see that a crowd had gathered on the steps, all pointing and whispering as their procession approached. Gringotts is run by goblins, Hagrid explained to Harry as they walked, his voice raised slightly to be heard over the murmurs of the crowd that followed them at a respectful distance. Very clever with money, goblins are. Wouldn't trust anyone else with my gold. The goblins standing guard at the entrance to the bank regarded their approach with the professional indifference that seemed characteristic of their species. One of them, distinguished by an elaborate uniform and a particularly fierce expression, stepped forward as they reached the steps. "Mr. Potter," he said in a gravelly voice, "we have been expecting you. I am Gornock, and I have been assigned to personally oversee your banking needs today." "Thank you," Harry said uncertainly. He had never had banking needs before, having never possessed more than a few pounds in his life. The interior of Gringotts was even more impressive than its exterior, all marble floors and high ceilings, filled with the sound of coins being counted and weighed. But Harry barely had time to take in the grandeur before he noticed that they had acquired an even larger audience. Witches and wizards conducting their own banking business had stopped to stare, and several more Daily Prophet photographers had appeared from somewhere. "The vault belonging to your parents," Gornock explained as he led them toward a row of carts, "has been sealed since their deaths, waiting for you to come of age. However, given the unusual circumstances, the Ministry has authorized early access for the purpose of purchasing your school supplies." Harry felt a thrill of excitement mixed with sadness. His parents had left him something that had been waiting for him all these years while he lived in ignorance at Privet Drive. The cart ride deep into the bowels of Gringotts was thrilling and terrifying in equal measure. Harry clung to the sides as they plunged through narrow tunnels at breakneck speed, Hagrid's face growing increasingly green beside him. When they finally stopped at Vault 713, Harry's legs felt distinctly shaky. "Your vault, Mr. Potter," Gornock announced, producing an ornate key. "Vault 713. The door swung open to reveal piles of gold, silver, and bronze coins that glittered in the torchlight. Harry stared in amazement at the treasure before him, trying to process the fact that this wealth had belonged to his parents and now belonged to him. "The gold ones are galleons," Hagrid explained, sounding relieved to be on solid ground again. "Silver's sickles, bronze are nuts. This should be more than enough for your school things." As they filled a small bag with coins, Harry couldn't help but think about the contrast between this underground treasure vault and the cupboard where he had spent the last 10 years. His parents had not only left him their love and protection, but also the means to build a new life in the wizarding world. The journey back to the surface was mercifully shorter, and soon they emerged into the main hall of Gringotts to find that the crowd had grown even larger. Word was spreading through Diagon Alley like wildfire, and it seemed like everyone wanted to catch a glimpse of Harry Potter on his first shopping trip. "Where to first?" Hagrid asked, consulting the Hogwarts letter that contained Harry's school supply list. "Madam Malkin's, I think," Aura Dawlish suggested. "Get him some proper robes before we tackle the rest of the list." The short walk to Madam Malkin's robes for all occasions became a parade. Shopkeepers emerged from their establishments to wave and call out greetings. Children pointed and whispered behind their parents' backs, and the Daily Prophet photographers followed at a discreet but persistent distance. Inside Madam Malkin's shop, the situation was slightly more manageable, though Harry could see curious faces pressed against the windows from the street outside. Madam Malkin herself, a squat witch with kind eyes and measuring tape that moved of its own accord, fussed over Harry like a doting grandmother. "Oh, my dear boy," she said, as she began taking his measurements. We all read about what those terrible people did to you. You're far too thin. We'll need to let these robes out a bit. You'll be growing now that you're eating properly." As she worked, pinning and adjusting his new school robes, Harry caught sight of himself in the mirror and was startled by what he saw. For the first time in his life, he was wearing clothes that fit properly, clothes that were meant for him rather than inherited from his much larger cousin. The black robes made his green eyes seem brighter behind his broken glasses, and for a moment he could almost see a resemblance to the heroes Hagrid had described. "Flourish and Blot's next," Hagrid announced once Harry's robes were properly fitted and packed. "Need to get your books." The bookshop was packed with customers, most of whom seemed more interested in Harry than in purchasing reading material. The proprietor, clearly delighted by the unprecedented crowd, bustled about, gathering Harry's required textbooks, while customers pressed closer to get a better look. "The Standard Book of Spells, Grade 1, the proprietor announced loudly, clearly playing to his audience. 1,000 magical herbs and fungi, magical theory, all the finest educational materials for our most famous student." At Ollivander's, the ancient wand shop tucked away in a narrow corner of Diagon Alley, the atmosphere was different. The elderly wandmaker emerged from the shadows between his towering shelves with an expression of deep interest rather than the star-struck excitement that had characterized most of their other stops. "Mr. Potter," he said in a soft, mysterious voice. "I wondered when I would be seeing you. Your parents were both customers of mine, you know. Your father favored an 11-inch mahogany wand, excellent for transfiguration. Your mother's was 10¼ inches, swishy, made of willow and particularly suited to charm work." The wand selection process was unlike anything Harry had ever experienced. Box after box was opened, wands were placed in his hand, and quickly retrieved when they produced no reaction, or sometimes unfortunate reactions like broken windows or singed curtains. Through it all, Mr. Ollivander watched with those pale, unsettling eyes, murmuring to himself about cores and woods and compatibility. "Curious," he said, after Harry had tried what felt like dozens of wands. "Very curious indeed." "What's curious?" Harry asked. "I remember every wand I've ever sold, Mr. Potter. It so happens that the phoenix whose tail feather resides in your wand gave another feather, just one other. It is curious that this wand should choose you when its brother gave you that scar." The wand that finally chose Harry was holly and phoenix feather, 11 inches, nice and supple. The moment his fingers closed around it, Harry felt a warmth spread through his hand and up his arm, and the wand tip emitted a shower of red and gold sparks that made the crowd outside the shop windows gasp in appreciation. "Exceptional," Mr. Ollivander murmured. "Holly and phoenix feather. An unusual combination. But I think we can expect great things from you, Mr. Potter." As they emerged from Ollivander's with Harry's new wand safely tucked away in its box, the crowd in Diagon Alley had swollen to impressive proportions. The Daily Prophet photographers were out in force now, and Harry could see witches and wizards apparating into the street specifically to catch a glimpse of the proceedings. "One more stop," Hagrid announced, shouldering their bags of purchases. "Aelop's Owl Emporium. Every student needs a pet, and I think you deserve something special." The owl that chose Harry was a beautiful snowy white female with intelligent amber eyes and an imperious manner that reminded him somehow of the way Aunt Petunia had always carried herself, but with a dignity that his aunt had never possessed. "She's perfect," Harry said, already feeling the bond forming between them as the owl settled on his arm. "What will you call her?" Hagrid asked. Harry thought for a moment, looking into those bright amber eyes. "Hedwig," he decided. It was a name from a history book he had read, and it seemed to suit her perfectly, As they made their way back through Diagon Alley toward the leaky cauldron, Harry reflected on the extraordinary day. He had discovered that he was wealthy, that he was famous, that he had a place in a magical world beyond anything he had ever imagined. The crowd that followed them was a visible reminder that his life had changed forever, that he would never again be the invisible boy living in a cupboard under the stairs. But more than that, as he listened to the voices of support and sympathy from the witches and wizards around him, Harry began to understand that he was not just famous for defeating a dark wizard as a baby. He was also, unexpectedly, a symbol of something else. A reminder that even in the wizarding world, children needed to be protected and cared for, and that fame and destiny were no excuse for neglect or cruelty. The shopping trip that was supposed to be a simple preparation for school had become something much more significant. It was Harry Potter's first public appearance as himself, not as the boy who lived, but as a real person with a real story that had moved an entire community to care about his welfare. And for the first time since he had sent those letters from the hut on the rock, Harry felt truly glad that he had decided to stop being invisible. The emergency owl arrived at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry just as Professor McGonagall was finishing her morning tea in the staff room. The barn owl swept through the open window with obvious urgency, dropping a ministry seal before her and immediately departing without waiting for a reply. Such behavior from a ministry owl was unusual enough to make McGonagall set down her teacup with particular care before breaking the crimson wax. The parchment bore the official letterhead of the Minister for Magic himself, and as McGonagall read the contents, her expression grew increasingly grave. By the time she reached the end of Cornelius Fudge's hastily written summary of the morning's events, her lips had compressed into the thin line that students had learned to associate with serious trouble. "Albus," she said aloud to the empty staff room, "we need to talk." 20 minutes later, Professor McGonagall sat across from Headmaster Dumbledore in his circular office, the minister's letter spread between them on the polished desk. Dumbledore's blue eyes, usually twinkling with some secret amusement, were serious as he considered the implications of Harry Potter's unprecedented revelation to the world. "I must confess, Minerva," Dumbledore said quietly, his long fingers steepled before him, "that in all my years, I never anticipated quite this turn of events." "The boy has exposed everything," McGonagall said, her voice tight with controlled anxiety. "His living conditions with the Dursleys, the mysterious letters, even details about his parents that the Ministry is scrambling to contain. The entire wizarding community is in an uproar, and the Muggle world is asking questions that we cannot easily answer." Dumbledore nodded slowly, his silver beard catching the morning light that streamed through the tall windows of his office. At 110 years old, he had guided Hogwarts through many crises, but this one presented unique challenges. "What troubles me most," he said, "is not that Harry chose to reveal his circumstances, but that he felt compelled to do so. We failed him, Minerva. I failed him. You couldn't have known how the Dursleys would treat him," McGonagall replied, though her tone suggested she had harbored her own doubts over the years. "Could I not?" Dumbledore's voice was heavy with regret. "I placed him there knowing Petunia's resentment toward the magical world, knowing Vernon's small-mindedness and fear. I told myself that the blood protection was worth any temporary discomfort, that love would eventually triumph over prejudice." He gestured toward the letter. "A cupboard under the stairs, Minerva, for 10 years. McGonagall removed her square glasses and rubbed the bridge of her nose wearily. At 55, she had served as deputy headmistress for many years, but the weight of this particular crisis felt especially heavy. "The question now is how we proceed. According to the minister's letter, Harry will be arriving at Hogwarts as scheduled for the start of term, but the circumstances will be, Complicated. Indeed. Dumbledore stood and moved to one of his office windows, gazing out over the grounds of Hogwarts. The ancient castle had stood for nearly 1,000 years, weathering countless storms, both literal and metaphorical. But the arrival of one 11-year-old boy threatened to bring unprecedented attention to its halls. We must consider security, certainly, but also Harry's well-being. He will arrive here as perhaps the most famous child in the wizarding world, carrying not only the weight of his defeat of Voldemort, but now also the sympathy of an entire community that knows of his suffering. A soft knock at the office door interrupted their discussion. "Come in," Dumbledore called, and Hagrid's massive frame filled the doorway. The gamekeeper's usually cheerful face was creased with worry as he entered the circular room. "Headmaster," Hagrid said, his voice unusually subdued. "I've just come back from London, from Diagon Alley with Harry." He settled his enormous bulk into the chair that Dumbledore enlarged for him with a casual wave of his wand. "You need to know what it's like out there." "Tell us," McGonagall said, leaning forward. Hagrid ran a massive hand through his tangled black hair. "It's like nothing I've ever seen, Professor. The crowds, the reporters, the way people are looking at him. He can't go anywhere without being recognized, without people wanting to touch him or talk to him or just stare. And the newspapers," he shook his head, "both ours and the Muggles. They're all calling him a hero, but not just for defeating you-know-who. They're saying he's brave for speaking out, for telling the truth about how he's been treated." "How is he handling the attention?" Dumbledore asked gently. "Better than I expected, to be honest," Hagrid admitted. "He's a good lad, doesn't let it go to his head. But he's overwhelmed, you can see it in his eyes. He's been invisible his whole life, and now suddenly everyone in the world knows who he is and wants something from him." McGonagall and Dumbledore exchanged glances. "Hagrid," McGonagall said carefully, "we need to discuss security arrangements for when Harry arrives at school." "Already been thinking about that," Hagrid said promptly. "The grounds will need extra protection. Can't have reporters trying to sneak onto the property, or parents showing up wanting to see the famous Harry Potter. And we'll need to make sure the other students don't overwhelm him on his first day." Dumbledore returned to his desk and pulled out a piece of parchment. "Let us consider this systematically. First, the immediate security concerns. Hagrid, I want you to coordinate with the Ministry Aurors who will undoubtedly be stationed around the school grounds during the first few weeks of term." "Already spoken to Kingsley Shacklebolt?" Hagrid nodded. "Good man, that one. He says they'll have people stationed at all the entrances to the grounds, and they'll be monitoring anyone trying to get to the castle who doesn't belong there." "Excellent. Minerva, we'll need to brief the other staff members on the situation. They must understand that Harry Potter's arrival will bring scrutiny not just to him, but to all of us. Every decision we make regarding his education and welfare will be watched and analyzed." McGonagall nodded grimly. "I'll call a special staff meeting for tomorrow morning. We'll need to discuss how to balance giving Harry a normal school experience with the reality that his every movement will be of interest to the outside world." "There's something else," Hagrid said hesitantly. "The minister mentioned that there might be political pressure. People wanting to use Harry's story for their own purposes. He's worried that some folks might try to turn the boy into a symbol of something he never asked to represent." Dumbledore's expression darkened slightly. "Yes, I feared as much. Harry has become not just the boy who lived, but also the boy who survived abuse. Both are powerful narratives that various factions will attempt to exploit." He stood again, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the office. "We must ensure that Hogwarts remains a sanctuary for him, a place where he can simply be a student learning magic, not a political symbol or an object of constant fascination. How do we manage that when every move he makes will be reported in the Daily Prophet? McGonagall asked practically. We establish clear boundaries, Dumbledore said firmly. No press access to the school grounds during term time. No interviews or photo opportunities without Harry's explicit consent, which, as his guardian during the school year, I will be responsible for granting or denying. And we make it clear to our students and their families that Harry Potter is to be treated as any other first-year student. Hagrid looked skeptical. With respect, Headmaster, that's going to be easier said than done. The other first years have been reading about Harry in the papers all summer. They'll all want to be his friend, or at least to say they know him. Which brings us to another concern, McGonagall added. Housing arrangements. Normally, first-year students are sorted into their houses immediately upon arrival, but given the circumstances, Harry will be sorted like any other student, Dumbledore said decisively. To do otherwise would only emphasize his difference and potentially create resentment among his peers. However, I will speak privately with the heads of all 4 houses to ensure they understand the unique challenges he may face. What about his dormitory? Hagrid asked. The other boys in his year will all want to know everything about him. He won't get a moment's peace. Dumbledore considered this. We cannot shield him completely from normal student interactions. That would defeat the purpose of his coming to Hogwarts. However, I will ensure that his dormitory has additional privacy protections, and that there are staff members available if he needs guidance in navigating these new social situations. McGonagall pulled out her own quill and began making notes. We'll need to coordinate with Madame Pomfrey as well. The boy has clearly been undernourished, and may have other health concerns related to his upbringing that we need to address discreetly. An excellent point, Dumbledore agreed. I also think we should arrange for Harry to arrive at the castle slightly early, perhaps a day or 2 before the other students. This will allow him to acclimate to his new environment without the additional pressure of hundreds of curious peers watching his every reaction. I could bring him up from London personally, Hagrid offered. Make sure he gets here safely and has some time to get used to the place before the chaos of the start of term. Thank you, Hagrid. That would be most helpful. Dumbledore moved to another window, this one overlooking the Black Lake. I find myself wondering what kind of young man we will meet when Harry arrives. He has shown remarkable courage in choosing to tell his story, and remarkable magical ability in ensuring that story reached its intended audience. But he has also lived a life of isolation and hardship that would challenge anyone's resilience. He's a good boy, Hagrid said firmly. Polite, thoughtful, doesn't expect special treatment, even though everyone's trying to give it to him. Reminds me of his parents in a way. They were both brave, but they were also kind. McGonagall looked up from her notes. Speaking of his parents, we need to be prepared for questions about James and Lily. The newspapers have been full of stories about their deaths, and Harry is only just learning the truth about what really happened that night. He's bound to have questions, and we need to be ready with honest, age-appropriate answers. I will handle those conversations personally, Dumbledore said. Harry deserves to know the truth about his parents, about the war they fought, and about the sacrifice that saved his life. But such knowledge must be given carefully, in a way that honors their memory without overwhelming him with the weight of expectations. The 3 of them sat in contemplative silence for a moment, each considering the magnitude of the challenge ahead. Finally, Dumbledore spoke again. We must remember, he said quietly, that beneath all the fame and attention, Harry Potter is simply an 11-year-old boy who has never had a proper childhood. Our primary responsibility is not to the boy who lived or to the symbol he has become, but to Harry himself. We must help him discover who he is and who he wishes to become, free from the burden of others' expectations. "It won't be easy," McGonagall said practically. "The entire wizarding world will be watching to see how we handle this situation." "Then we shall give them something worth watching," Dumbledore replied, with a slight return of his characteristic twinkle. "We shall show them that Hogwarts remains what it has always been, a place where young people come to learn, to grow, and to discover the magic within themselves. Harry Potter may be famous, but here he will simply be a student. And perhaps, after 10 years of being treated as a burden and a freak, that will be the greatest magic of all." As the three of them continued their planning, the ancient castle of Hogwarts seemed to settle more deeply into its foundations, as if preparing itself for the challenge ahead. Soon it would welcome home a boy who had never truly had a home, and in doing so, it would face scrutiny unlike any it had ever known. But Hogwarts had stood for 1,000 years, weathering wars and peace, triumph and tragedy. It would endure this as well, and perhaps, in protecting Harry Potter, it would rediscover its own most important purpose, being a sanctuary for those who needed one most. Platform 9 3/4 was busier than Hagrid had ever seen it in all his years of escorting students to Hogwarts. What should have been the usual controlled chaos of families saying goodbye to their children had been transformed into something resembling a media circus, complete with daily profit photographers positioned at strategic intervals, and ministry officials attempting to maintain some semblance of order. "Stay close," Hagrid murmured to Harry as they approached the Scarlet Hogwarts Express. "We'll get you on the train as quickly as possible." Harry pulled his cloak hood up higher, hoping to avoid immediate recognition, but he could already hear whispers rippling through the crowd. Parents were pointing in their direction, children were stretching on their tiptoes to get a better look, and he could see the telltale puff of purple smoke from magical cameras in the distance. "Is that really him?" "Harry Potter. He looks just like his father." "Poor dear, after everything he's been through." "The boy who lived in a cupboard." The whispers followed them down the platform, and Harry felt his cheeks burning with embarrassment, and something that might have been shame. Even here, surrounded by magical families who should understand his world, he was still defined by the worst parts of his past. "Don't listen to them," Hagrid said quietly, his massive hand resting protectively on Harry's shoulder. "You've got nothing to be ashamed of. You've got everything to be proud of." They found an empty compartment near the middle of the train, and Hagrid helped Harry load his trunk and Hedwig's cage into the luggage rack. Through the window, Harry could see more photographers gathering on the platform, their cameras trained on his compartment. "Right then," Hagrid said, settling his enormous frame onto the seat across from Harry. "I'll stay with you until the train leaves. Make sure no one bothers you." But even Hagrid's intimidating presence couldn't prevent the stream of curious students who found reasons to walk past their compartment. Some were subtle about their staring, others were decidedly less so. A group of older students had actually pressed their faces against the glass until Hagrid's glare sent them scurrying away. "Excuse me," a voice said from the compartment doorway, and Harry looked up to see a red-haired boy about his own age standing there uncertainly. "I'm sorry to bother you, but everywhere else is full. Would it be all right if I sat here?" Harry recognized him immediately from the crowds in Diagon Alley, one of the Weasley family, whose red hair was unmistakable. "Of course," Harry said, grateful for what seemed like a genuine request rather than another excuse to gawk at him. The boy entered the compartment and began wrestling his trunk into the luggage rack. "I'm Ron," he said, slightly out of breath from the effort. "Ron Weasley." Harry Potter, Harry replied, then immediately felt foolish. Of course, Ron knew who he was. Everyone in the wizarding world knew who he was now. But Ron just nodded, as if meeting famous people was an everyday occurrence. "My mum read your letter in the Daily Prophet," he said, as he settled into the seat beside Harry. "She cried for about an hour afterward. She kept saying that if she ever met your aunt and uncle, she'd give them a piece of her mind." Harry felt an unexpected warmth at this revelation. "Your mum cried about me?" "About what happened to you," Ron clarified. "She said no child should ever be treated like that, famous or not." "My dad said the same thing." Ron's ears went slightly pink. "Actually, my whole family's been talking about you all summer. Not in a weird way," he added quickly. "Just, we all think what you did was really brave." "What I did?" "Speaking out. Telling the truth when you didn't have to. My dad says it takes real courage to ask for help when you need it." Before Harry could respond, the compartment door slid open again to reveal a girl about their age with bushy brown hair and an armload of books. "Has anyone seen a toad? A boy named Neville has lost one." "No," Ron said, looking slightly overwhelmed by the girl's intense manner. "Sorry." She stepped into the compartment anyway, her sharp brown eyes taking in the scene with obvious intelligence. "You're Harry Potter," she said matter-of-factly. "I've read all about you in the newspapers, both the wizarding ones and the muggle ones. I'm Hermione Granger." "Nice to meet you," Harry said, noting that she seemed to be the first person all day who had mentioned his recent notoriety without tiptoeing around it. "I think what you did was very important," Hermione continued, settling into the seat across from them with her usual directness. "Bringing attention to the treatment of magical children by non-magical guardians. There are probably other cases that have gone unreported because the children didn't know they had options." Ron looked impressed despite himself. "You've thought about this a lot." "I've read about it a lot," Hermione corrected. "I've been reading everything I can about the wizarding world since I got my letter. When your story broke, Harry, it made me realize how much I still don't understand about how our two worlds interact." The train whistle blew, and through the window, Harry could see Hagrid stepping back onto the platform. The gamekeeper raised a massive hand in farewell, and Harry waved back, feeling suddenly anxious about losing his most reliable protector. "Don't worry," Ron said, noticing Harry's expression. "Hagrid will be at the castle when we get there. He's the one who manages all the first-year arrivals." As the Hogwarts Express pulled away from platform 9 3/4, Harry settled back in his seat, grateful for the company of two people who seemed inclined to treat him as a normal person rather than a celebrity or a curiosity. But his relief was short-lived. "Well, well," a cold voice drawled from the doorway. "Harry Potter, I heard you were on the train." Harry looked up to see a pale boy with white blonde hair and cold grey eyes standing in the entrance to their compartment. Two larger boys flanked him like bodyguards, their faces set in identical sneers. "I'm Malfoy," the boy said, stepping into the compartment without invitation. "Draco Malfoy. Perhaps you've heard of my family." "I've heard of your father," Harry said carefully, remembering Lucius Malfoy from his brief appearance during the crisis meetings. "Good. Then you'll know that we're the sort of people you should associate with." Draco's grey eyes swept dismissively over Ron and Hermione. Not this sort." Ron's ears went red. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Oh, I think we all know what it means," Draco said with a smirk. "Potter's famous now, not just for surviving the Dark Lord, but for his touching story of abuse and neglect. Everyone wants to be his friend, even people who have nothing to offer him." "That's enough," Harry said, standing up. He was surprised by the anger in his own voice. "I'm only trying to help," Draco continued smoothly. "You're going to need allies at Hogwarts, Potter, and you should choose them wisely. My father has considerable influence in the Ministry. He could be very helpful to someone in your situation." "My situation? A child with no family connections, no understanding of our world's politics, no one to guide you through the complexities of wizarding society." Draco's smile was sharp and calculating. "My father was very impressed by how you handled your media debut. He thinks you could be quite powerful if you allied yourself with the right people." Harry felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning on the train. "And what would your father expect in return for this guidance?" "Nothing unreasonable, just friendship, loyalty, the occasional favor between allies." "No, thank you," Harry said firmly. Draco's pleasant expression flickered for just a moment, revealing something harder underneath. "You're making a mistake, Potter. You can't stay on top forever just by being a tragic figure. Eventually, people will expect more from you than just a sad story." "Get out," Ron said, standing as well. He said no. "This isn't over, Potter," Draco said, as he backed toward the door. "You'll learn soon enough how things really work in our world." After the three Slytherins left, the compartment felt oddly quiet. Harry sank back into his seat, disturbed by the encounter in ways he couldn't quite articulate. "Don't listen to him," Hermione said fiercely. "People like that think everything is about connections and influence. They can't understand someone who just wants to do the right thing." "My dad says the Malfoys are trouble," Ron added. "Always have been. During the war, they claimed they were forced to serve you-know-who, but no one really believes it." The rest of the journey passed more peacefully, though Harry noticed that their compartment continued to attract attention. Students found excuses to walk past their door, and he caught glimpses of faces pressed against the window whenever the train stopped. By the time they reached Hogsmeade Station, Harry felt emotionally exhausted from the constant scrutiny. The traditional boat ride across the Black Lake was surreal. Harry sat with Ron, Hermione, and a round-faced boy named Neville Longbottom, who had eventually found his toad. But he was acutely aware that every other boat seemed to be positioned to get the best possible view of him. Even Hagrid, who was manning the lead boat as usual, kept glancing back to check on him. "First years," Hagrid called as they disembarked at the castle dock. "This way for the first years." But as they approached the great doors of Hogwarts, Harry could see that this year's arrival was anything but traditional. Professor McGonagall stood waiting for them, her usually stern expression set even more severely than usual. Behind her, Harry could see other professors lined up in the entrance hall, and through the open doors to the Great Hall, he glimpsed what looked like far more people than usual, seated at the house tables. "Welcome to Hogwarts," McGonagall said, her voice carrying clearly over the excited chatter of the first years. "In a few moments, you will be sorted into your houses. However, this year, we have some additional guests who have come to witness this historic occasion." Harry's stomach sank as he realized what she meant. Through the doors to the Great Hall, he could see not just the usual student body and faculty, but also what appeared to be ministry officials, daily prophet reporters, and various other dignitaries, all seated at a special table that had been added for the occasion. "The sorting ceremony," McGonagall continued, "remains what it has always been, a private school tradition that determines where young witches and wizards will make their homes for the next 7 years. Regardless of who may be watching, each student will be sorted based on their own qualities and potential. Nothing more." Her sharp gaze found Harry in the crowd of first years, and he saw something like apology in her expression before she turned to lead them into the Great Hall. The hall erupted in applause the moment Harry crossed the threshold, not the polite clapping that usually greeted new students, but sustained, emotional applause that seemed to come from every corner of the room. Harry kept his eyes fixed on McGonagall's back, his face burning with embarrassment, as they made their way to the front of the hall. "Potter! Harry!" McGonagall called when his turn came, and the hall fell so silent that the rustle of robes seemed deafeningly loud. Harry walked to the three-legged stool where the sorting hat waited, aware that hundreds of pairs of eyes were following his every movement. As McGonagall placed the ancient hat on his head, he closed his eyes and tried to block out everything except the voice that suddenly filled his mind. "Well, well," the sorting hat murmured inside his thoughts. "Harry Potter, I've been wondering when I'd meet you properly. You've caused quite a stir, haven't you?" "I didn't mean to," Harry thought back. "Perhaps not, but you did it nonetheless. And that tells me a great deal about you. You could have stayed silent, stayed invisible, stayed safe. But when the moment came to speak truth to power, you chose courage over comfort. That, my boy, is the mark of a true Gryffindor." "Gryffindor!" the hat shouted aloud, and the great hall exploded into cheers that seemed to shake the very foundations of the castle. As Harry made his way to the Gryffindor table, he was engulfed in welcomes and congratulations from his new housemates. But even as he shook hands and accepted pats on the back, he was aware that this was only the beginning. He was no longer just Harry Potter, the boy who lived. He was Harry Potter, the boy who had chosen to stop being invisible, and everything that happened from this moment forward would be watched, analyzed, and remembered by the entire wizarding world. For better or worse, Harry Potter's real education was just beginning. The potions classroom in the dungeons of Hogwarts was unlike anything Harry had experienced in his brief time at the castle. Cold, dimly lit by flickering candles, and filled with the unsettling sight of pickled animals floating in glass jars, it felt more like a medieval torture chamber than a place of learning. But what made Harry's skin crawl more than the eerie atmosphere was the way Professor Snape's black eyes seemed to follow his every movement from the moment he entered the room. "Potter," Snape said quietly, as Harry took his seat next to Ron at one of the stonework tables. "Our new celebrity." The word celebrity dripped with such disdain that several students turned to stare. Harry felt his cheeks burn as he tried to focus on arranging his new potions textbook and ingredients kit on the table before him. Professor Severus Snape was a thin man with sallow skin and long, greasy black hair that hung like curtains around his face. His hooked nose and cold black eyes gave him the appearance of a particularly unfriendly bat, and his voice, when he addressed the class, carried an undertone of barely concealed contempt. "You are here to learn the subtle science and exact art of potion making," Snape began, his voice barely above a whisper, yet somehow carrying to every corner of the dungeon. "I don't expect you will really understand the beauty of the softly simmering cauldron with its shimmering fumes, the delicate power of liquids that creep through human veins, bewitching the mind, ensnaring the senses." Harry found himself fascinated, despite his discomfort. There was something almost poetic about Snape's introduction, even if the man himself seemed determined to make everyone in the room feel unwelcome. "I can teach you how to bottle fame, brew glory, even stop a death," Snape continued, his dark eyes sweeping across the room before settling once again on Harry. "If you aren't as big a bunch of dunderheads as I usually have to teach." The silence that followed was broken only by the scratch of quills as students hastily took notes. Harry was reaching for his own quill when Snape's voice cut through the air like a blade. "Potter," Snape said suddenly, "our famous Harry Potter. Tell me, what would I get if I added powdered root of asphodel to an infusion of wormwood?" Harry's mind went blank. He had read his potions textbook, but he certainly hadn't memorized it, and the Latin names for ingredients were still largely foreign to him. He glanced at Ron, who looked equally bewildered, then at Hermione, whose hand had shot into the air so fast she nearly knocked over her ink bottle. "I don't know, sir," Harry said quietly. "Tut, tut," Snape said, his thin lips curving in what might have been a smile but looked more like a sneer. "Fame clearly isn't everything." Several Slytherin students sniggered, and Harry felt his face growing hotter. "Let's try again. Potter, where would you look if I told you to find me a bezoar?" Again, Hermione's hand shot up, and again, Harry had no idea. "I don't know, sir." "Thought you wouldn't open a book before coming, eh, Potter?" Snape's voice was now openly mocking. "What is the difference between monkshood and wolfsbane?" "I don't know," Harry repeated, his voice barely audible. He could feel the eyes of every student in the class on him, some sympathetic, others gleefully entertained by his humiliation. "I think Hermione does, though. Why don't you try her?" The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Snape's black eyes glittered dangerously as he stepped closer to Harry's table. "Sit down," he snapped at Hermione, who slowly lowered her hand. "For your information, Potter, asphodel, and wormwood make a sleeping potion so powerful it is known as the Draught of Living Death. A bezoar is a stone taken from the stomach of a goat, and it will save you from most poisons. As for monkshood and wolfsbane, they are the same plant, which also goes by the name of aconite." Snape moved even closer, looming over Harry's desk. "Well, why aren't you all copying that down?" There was a sudden rustling as everyone hurried to take notes. Snape waited until the scratching of quills had died down before speaking again, his voice now so quiet it was almost a whisper. "And Potter," he said, "a point will be taken from Gryffindor for your cheek." As the class progressed into the actual brewing of a simple potion to cure boils, Harry found himself struggling not just with the unfamiliar ingredients and techniques, but with Professor Snape's relentless attention. Every few minutes, the man would appear at Harry's shoulder, watching him work with an expression of barely disguised distaste. "Crushing those snake fangs, Potter, not pulverizing them," Snape said coldly as Harry worked at his mortar and pestle. "And that's too much dried nettles. Did they teach you to follow instructions where you grew up, or were you too busy being neglected to learn basic reading comprehension?" The comment hung in the air like a poison cloud. Ron's face went red with anger, and Harry could feel the shocked stares of his classmates. Snape had just referenced, with casual cruelty, the very abuse that had made headlines throughout the wizarding world. "That's enough," Hermione said, her voice shaking with indignation. "You have no right to say something like that." "Miss Granger," Snape said, without taking his eyes off Harry, "I wasn't aware that first-year students were qualified to tell professors what they have the right to say." 5 points from Gryffindor. "Sir," Neville Longbottom's voice came from across the room, where his cauldron was emitting an alarming amount of green smoke. "I think my potion is going wrong." Snape swept away from Harry's table to deal with Neville's disaster, leaving Harry staring down at his own cauldron with hands that were shaking slightly. The casual cruelty of Snape's reference to his childhood had hit harder than any of the man's academic criticisms. "Don't listen to him," Ron muttered furiously. "He's a git. Everyone knows he favors Slytherin." "He's right, though," Harry said quietly. "I don't know anything. I spent 10 years in a cupboard while other kids were learning basic things, and now I'm supposed to compete with people who've been raised in this world." "That's not your fault," Hermione said fiercely from the table behind them. "And you're not stupid, you're just starting from a different place." But Harry's confidence had been badly shaken by Snape's attack, and the rest of the potions lesson passed in a haze of anxiety and self-doubt. when Neville's cauldron melted into a twisted heap of metal and sent boiling potion cascading across the dungeon floor, Snape blamed Harry for not preventing it, despite the fact that Harry had been working at a completely different table. "Idiot boy!" Snape snarled at Neville, who was now covered in painful-looking boils. "I suppose you added the porcupine quills before taking the cauldron off the fire? Take him to the hospital wing," he told Seamus Finnegan, then rounded on Harry. "You, Potter. Why didn't you tell him not to add the quills? Thought he'd make you look good if he messed up even worse. That's another point lost for Gryffindor." Harry opened his mouth to protest the unfairness of being blamed for someone else's mistake, but the look in Snape's eyes stopped him cold. There was something more than professional dislike in that gaze, something personal and bitter that Harry didn't understand. The contrast with Professor McGonagall's Transfiguration class, which followed immediately after potions, was so stark it was almost disorienting. Where Snape had been cold and openly hostile, McGonagall was strict but fair, and her obvious competence and authority commanded respect rather than fear. Transfiguration is some of the most complex and dangerous magic you will learn at Hogwarts, she announced, as the first years filed into her classroom. "Anyone messing around in my class will leave and not come back. You have been warned." But even in McGonagall's more welcoming environment, Harry found that his newfound fame continued to complicate his educational experience. When McGonagall demonstrated the basic principles of transformation by turning her desk into a pig and back again, half the class spent more time watching Harry's reaction than paying attention to the actual lesson. "Mr. Potter," McGonagall said, after she had given them each a match to practice turning into a needle, "might I suggest you focus on your own work, rather than worrying about whether your classmates are watching you?" Harry looked up from his match, which was stubbornly remaining a match despite his best efforts, to find that she was right. He had been unconsciously glancing around the room, distracted by the whispered conversations and pointed looks. "Sorry, Professor," he said. "There's no need to apologize," McGonagall said, her voice gentling slightly. "But you'll find your studies much more rewarding if you can learn to tune out distractions." She moved on to help other students, but Harry caught the meaningful look she gave him. It was clear that she understood the unique challenges he was facing, even if she couldn't solve them for him. "At least she's not taking points off for breathing," Ron muttered, still annoyed about Snape's treatment in potions. Snape was out of line, Hermione agreed, having successfully turned her match silver, though it still retained its original shape. "What he said about your childhood was completely inappropriate." Harry had been trying not to think about Snape's comment, but Hermione's words brought it back to the forefront of his mind. "Maybe he has a point, though," he said. "Maybe I don't belong here. Everyone else grew up knowing about magic, knowing how things work. I'm starting from nothing." "So what?" Draco Malfoy's voice came from the table behind them. "Granger's Muggle-born and she's managing fine. The difference is that she's actually intelligent." Harry turned to glare at Draco, whose pale face wore its usual expression of smug superiority. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means," Draco said loudly enough for surrounding tables to hear, "that being famous doesn't make you special. Being pitied doesn't make you smart. And writing sob letters to newspapers doesn't make you a hero." "Shut up, Malfoy," Ron said hotly. "Or what, Weasley? You'll have your mother send me a howler?" Draco's grey eyes glittered with malice. "At least Potter has an excuse for not knowing anything about our world. What's yours for being poor?" "That's enough." McGonagall's sharp voice cut across the brewing argument. She had appeared at their cluster of tables without anyone noticing. "Mr. Malfoy, since you seem more interested in provoking your classmates than practicing transfiguration, perhaps you'd like to demonstrate your superior knowledge by showing us a perfect needle transformation. Draco's confident expression faltered as he looked down at his match, which was no more needle-like than anyone else's. It's more difficult than it appears, Professor. Indeed it is, McGonagall said crisply, which is why I suggest you focus your energy on mastering the subject matter, rather than critiquing your classmates' backgrounds. She turned to address the entire class. Let me be clear to all of you. Your worth in this classroom will be determined by your effort, your progress, and your behavior. Nothing else. But even McGonagall's firm intervention couldn't completely dispel the tension that had settled over the room. As the class worked on their transformations, Harry was acutely aware of the whispered conversations happening around him, the way some students seemed eager to befriend him, while others, particularly those from Slytherin, watched him with barely concealed hostility. "It's going to be like this all year, isn't it?" Harry asked Ron quietly, as they packed up their books at the end of class. "Probably," Ron said honestly. "But that doesn't mean you have to let it get to you. My dad always says that the only opinion that really matters is your own." "Easy for him to say," Harry replied. He didn't grow up being told he was a freak and then suddenly become famous for being abused. Hermione, who had been listening to their conversation, stopped packing her bag and turned to face Harry directly. "You know what I think? I think you're letting Professor Snape and Malfoy define how you see yourself. Yes, you're starting from a different place than some of us. Yes, people are paying attention to you for reasons you didn't choose. But you're here now, and you're learning, and you're not responsible for other people's reactions." "She's right," Ron added. "Besides, Snape's horrible to everyone. It's not personal." Harry wasn't entirely convinced that Snape's hostility wasn't personal. There had been something in the professor's eyes that suggested a deeper animosity, but he appreciated his friend's support. As they made their way out of the Transfiguration classroom and toward the Great Hall for lunch, Harry tried to push aside his doubts and focus on the positive aspects of his Hogwarts experience. But even as he walked through the corridors with Ron and Hermione, he remained aware of the curious stares, the whispered comments, and the way conversations stopped when he passed. Fame, Harry was beginning to realize, was a double-edged sword. It brought sympathy and support, but it also brought scrutiny and expectation. And in the academic environment of Hogwarts, where knowledge and skill were supposed to be the measures of worth, his celebrity status often felt more like a burden than a blessing. The challenge would be learning to navigate this new reality while still finding his place as simply Harry, not the boy who lived, not the famous abuse survivor, but just an 11-year-old boy trying to master magic and make friends in a world that was still largely foreign to him. The letter arrived at the Burrow on a grey October morning, delivered by a stern-looking ministry owl that refused the bacon Molly Weasley offered, before departing with obvious disdain for the chaotic household. Arthur Weasley recognized the official seal immediately, and felt his stomach clench with familiar dread. In his 20 years of working for the Ministry of Magic, he had learned that letters bearing the minister's personal seal rarely brought good news. "Official business?" Molly asked, looking up from where she was attempting to convince baby Ginny to eat her breakfast, while simultaneously preparing lunchboxes for the boys still at Hogwarts. Arthur nodded grimly as he broke the crimson wax seal and unfolded the parchment. As he read, his expression grew increasingly troubled, and Molly found herself watching his face rather than focusing on Ginny's determined efforts to fling porridge at the ceiling. "What is it?" she asked, when Arthur finished reading and set the letter down with a heavy sigh. "Cornelius wants to see me this afternoon," Arthur said, rubbing his eyes beneath his horn-rimmed glasses. "About Ron's friendship with Harry Potter." The words hung in the air like a curse. Molly set down Ginny's spoon with perhaps more force than necessary, her round face flushing with indignation. Ron's friendship? What business is that of the ministry's? According to this, Arthur said, gesturing at the letter, there are concerns about potential security risks. Questions about whether our family might be using Ron's connection to Harry for political advantage. Suggestions that we need to be more careful about how we manage our son's associations. Molly's flush deepened to an angry red. Political advantage? That boy is Ron's friend, nothing more. He's a child who's been through more hardship than most adults could bear. And if Ron wants to befriend him, then that's Ron's choice to make. I know that, Arthur said quietly. And you know that. But the ministry sees something different. They see a family with known sympathies for Muggle rights, a family that's never been particularly wealthy or influential, suddenly having access to the most famous child in the wizarding world. From upstairs came the sound of heavy footsteps, and Percy Weasley appeared at the kitchen doorway, his red hair neatly combed and his Hogwarts prefect badge polished to a shine. At 14, he was already showing signs of the bureaucratic mindset that would define his later career, and Arthur could see the conflict in his son's expression as he took in the tension in the kitchen. Is something wrong? Percy asked, his voice carefully neutral. Arthur and Molly exchanged glances. Their third son had always been the most ambitious of their children, the most eager to follow rules and gain the approval of authority figures. Arthur loved Percy dearly, but he also worried about the boy's tendency to prioritize institutional loyalty over family bonds. Your father's been summoned to the ministry, Molly said, her voice tight with controlled anger. Apparently they have concerns about Ron's friendship with Harry Potter. Percy's expression grew even more carefully neutral, which told Arthur everything he needed to know about his son's thoughts on the matter. I see, Percy said. And what kind of concerns? The kind that suggests the ministry thinks we might be social climbers looking to profit from a boy's tragedy, Arthur replied, unable to keep the bitterness from his voice. Well, Percy said after a moment, perhaps they have a point. I mean, Ron's friendship with Potter has certainly brought a lot of attention to our family. People at school are constantly asking me about what Harry Potter is really like, whether he's mentioned anything about his experiences with you-know-who, whether our family has any special insights into his situation. Molly's eyes flashed dangerously. Percy Ignatius Weasley, are you suggesting that your brother is using Harry Potter for social advancement? I'm not suggesting anything, Percy said quickly, recognizing the warning signs in his mother's tone. I'm simply pointing out that the situation could be perceived that way by people who don't know our family well. Before either parent could respond, the kitchen door burst open and Fred and George Weasley tumbled in, their red hair wind-swept and their identical faces lit with mischievous grins. At 13, the twins had already established themselves as Hogwarts' premier troublemakers, and Arthur could tell from their expressions that they had been up to something that would probably result in detention. "Mum," Fred announced cheerfully, seemingly oblivious to the tension in the room. "You'll never guess what happened in Transfiguration today." "Professor McGonagall turned Crabbe into a toad," George added, with obvious glee. "Well, she tried to. He only made it halfway, so he was sort of a toad with Crabbe's voice. Quite disturbing, actually. And the best part," Fred continued, "was that it happened right after he made some nasty comment about Harry being our attention-seeking liar." McGonagall was not amused. Arthur felt another wave of dread wash over him. What kind of comment? The twins' grins faded as they finally noticed the serious atmosphere in the kitchen. George glanced at his parents' faces and seemed to realize that they had walked into something more significant than a typical family discussion. "Oh," he said, his voice becoming uncharacteristically subdued. Just the usual rubbish, saying that Harry made up the abuse stories to get sympathy, that sort of thing. Why? Is something wrong? Your father's been called to the ministry, Molly said, about Ron's friendship with Harry. Fred and George exchanged one of their wordless twin communications before Fred spoke up. That's ridiculous. Ron doesn't give a fig about Harry's fame. Half the time he seems to forget Harry's famous at all. Tell that to the ministry, Arthur said grimly. We could, George said thoughtfully. We've been thinking about writing a letter to the Daily Prophet, actually, about how people at school are treating Harry. Arthur's blood went cold. Absolutely not. The last thing we need is more publicity. But, Dad, Fred protested, you should see what it's like for him at school. The Slytherins are constantly making snide comments. Some of the other houses treat him like he's made of glass, and the professors don't know whether to baby him or pretend nothing happened. It's not fair. None of this is fair, Arthur said heavily. But getting involved in public debates about Harry's situation will only make things worse for our family. Percy, who had been listening to this exchange with growing discomfort, cleared his throat. Perhaps, he said carefully, it would be wise to encourage Ron to diversify his friendships. Not to abandon Potter, obviously, but to make it clear that he has other social connections as well. The silence that followed was deafening. Molly's face had gone very white, and Arthur could see her hands trembling slightly as she reached for baby Ginny, who had been quietly observing the adult conversation with wide eyes. Percy, Molly said, her voice dangerously quiet. Are you suggesting that Ron should distance himself from a friend because it might be politically inconvenient? I'm suggesting that Ron should be strategic about how he conducts his relationships, Percy replied, his chin lifting defensively. We're not a powerful family, Mum. We don't have the luxury of ignoring political realities. Political realities? Fred's voice rose in indignation. Harry's our friend. Harry Potter is a political symbol, Percy corrected, and anyone associated with him becomes part of that symbolism, whether they want to or not. Arthur watched his sons argue with a growing sense of helplessness. This was exactly what he had feared would happen. The pressure and scrutiny surrounding Harry Potter was tearing at the fabric of his family, forcing them to choose between loyalty and pragmatism. Enough, Molly said suddenly, her voice cutting through the boys' argument like a knife. Percy, go to your room. Fred, George, you have homework to finish. Arthur and I need to talk. The boys filed out, Percy with stiff dignity, the twins with obvious reluctance. When they were alone, except for baby Ginny, Molly turned to her husband with fire in her eyes. You are not going to let the ministry bully us into abandoning that boy, she said fiercely. I don't care what they threaten. Harry Potter is welcome in this house, and Ron is welcome to be his friend, and anyone who doesn't like it can go hang. Arthur reached across the table and took his wife's hand. After 18 years of marriage, he knew better than to argue with Molly when she had that particular expression on her face. He also knew that she was absolutely right. I won't let them bully us, he promised. But Molly, we need to be careful. My job at the ministry isn't exactly secure under the best of circumstances. If they decide I'm a security risk because of Ron's friendship with Harry, then we'll manage, Molly said firmly. We always have. But we won't abandon a child who needs our support just because it's politically convenient. Arthur squeezed her hand gratefully. This was why he had fallen in love with Molly Pruett all those years ago. Her fierce loyalty, her unwavering moral compass, her refusal to let fear dictate her actions. "What will you tell them at the ministry?" Molly asked. "The truth," Arthur said. "That Ron is friends with Harry, because Harry is a decent, kind boy who happens to be Ron's age and happens to share his interests. That our family has no political agenda beyond wanting to see a child who has suffered far too much find some happiness and normalcy, and that anyone who tries to use an 11-year-old's friendship for their own purposes should be ashamed of themselves." Molly smiled for the first time since the letter had arrived. "Think they'll listen?" "Probably not," Arthur admitted. "But at least they'll know where we stand." As Arthur prepared to leave for his appointment at the ministry, he reflected on the strange turn his life had taken. 6 weeks ago, his biggest worry had been whether he could afford new robes for the boy's return to school. Now he was facing potential career consequences because his youngest son had befriended the most famous child in the wizarding world. But as he looked around the kitchen of the burrow, with its magical clock showing where each family member was located, its self-washing dishes, and its general atmosphere of chaotic warmth, Arthur knew that some things were more important than job security. His family's values, their commitment to doing what was right rather than what was easy, their belief that a person's worth wasn't determined by their fame or their political connections, these things were worth fighting for. The ministry could pressure him all they wanted. They could threaten his position, question his loyalty, suggest that his family was somehow profiting from Harry Potter's tragedy. But they couldn't make him abandon a child who needed support, and they couldn't force his son to choose politics over friendship. As Arthur disapparated from the front garden of the burrow, he carried with him the certainty that whatever happened at the ministry that afternoon, his family would face the consequences together. They had survived the previous war, they had weathered poverty and social ostracism, and they would survive this as well. After all, they were Weasleys, and Weasleys looked after their own, even when their own included a lonely, famous boy who just wanted to be treated like a normal child. The political pressure surrounding Harry Potter was only going to intensify as the year progressed. Arthur was certain of that. But he was equally certain that his family would weather whatever storms came their way, because some things, loyalty, friendship, doing what was right, were more important than political convenience. And if the Ministry of Magic couldn't understand that, then perhaps it was time for the Ministry to remember what it was supposed to be fighting for in the first place. The drawing room at Malfoy Manor had always served as the stage for Lucius Malfoy's most delicate political negotiations, but tonight's gathering represented something particularly ambitious. Seated around the antique table were some of the most influential pureblood families in Wizarding Britain, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of the elaborate crystal chandelier that had graced the manor for 3 centuries. "The Potter situation," Lucius began, his cold grey eyes surveying the assembled guests, "presents us with an unprecedented opportunity." Narcissa Malfoy observed from her position at the far end of the table, her beautiful face composed in an expression of polite interest that masked her sharp intelligence. At 36, she had spent nearly 2 decades navigating the treacherous waters of pure-blood society, and she recognized the delicate nature of what her husband was proposing. "Opportunity?" questioned Amicus Caro, his thick features creased with confusion. "The boy has made a mockery of the traditional order. He's turned the entire wizarding world into sympathizers for his muggle-raised sob story." "Precisely," Lucius said smoothly, rising from his chair to pace before the ornate fireplace. "He has captured the sympathy and attention of the masses in a way that no political figure has managed in decades. Public opinion is a powerful tool, and young Potter has demonstrated an instinctive understanding of how to wield it." Narcissa watched her husband work his particular brand of magic on their guests. Lucius had always possessed an extraordinary talent for taking what others saw as setbacks and reframing them as opportunities. It was a skill that had served him well during the dark years when many of their circle had found themselves imprisoned or discredited. "What are you suggesting?" asked Walden McNair, leaning forward with interest. "I'm suggesting that we recognize young Potter for what he truly is, not just the boy who lived, but a master of public relations who could be tremendously valuable as an ally." Lucius paused beside a portrait of his ancestors, their painted eyes seeming to watch the proceedings with aristocratic approval. Consider what he accomplished with a single letter. He exposed the ministry's failure to protect him, generated sympathy that spans every level of wizarding society, and positioned himself as both victim and hero simultaneously. "He's 11 years old," protested another guest, whose name Narcissa couldn't quite recall, but whose family had lost considerable standing during the war. "Age is irrelevant," Lucius replied. "Power is power, regardless of the vessel that contains it. And Potter has demonstrated more political instinct in one act of defiance than most of us manage in years of careful maneuvering." Narcissa felt a familiar chill as she recognized the direction her husband's thoughts were taking. The Malfoy family had survived the fall of the Dark Lord by carefully positioning themselves as reformed allies of the current regime. But she knew that Lucius's ambitions extended far beyond mere survival. He wanted influence, power, the ability to shape the wizarding world according to his vision. And now he saw Harry Potter as a potential weapon in that pursuit. "What about the boy's current associations?" asked McNair. "He's aligned himself with the Weasleys, blood traitors of the worst sort." "Children's friendships are rarely permanent," Lucius said dismissively. "Young Potter is isolated, thrust into a world he doesn't understand, surrounded by people who want to use him for their own purposes. What he needs is guidance from those who truly understand power and how to wield it responsibly." Narcissa thought of her own son, Draco, currently in his first year at Hogwarts alongside Potter. Her letters from school painted a picture of a boy struggling with the complex dynamics surrounding the famous Harry Potter, wanting to be associated with such celebrity, while simultaneously resenting Potter's effortless command of attention and sympathy. "And how do you propose we provide this guidance?" asked another guest. "Carefully," Lucius said, his pale features settling into an expression of calculated charm. "Potter has shown himself to be suspicious of obvious manipulation. His rejection of Draco's initial overture demonstrates that he won't be easily swayed by crude appeals to power or influence." The mention of Draco made Narcissa's attention sharpen. Her son's letters had become increasingly frustrated over the past few months, filled with complaints about Potter's friendship with that Weasley boy and his apparent indifference to the social hierarchy that Draco had been raised to understand and respect. "Then what do you suggest?" pressed Caro. Lucius smiled, and Narcissa recognized the expression from countless previous schemes. "We demonstrate our value through action rather than words. Potter's story has revealed significant gaps in the ministry's child protection protocols. Who better to champion reform than families with long histories of commitment to wizarding children's welfare? The Malfoys have never been particularly associated with child welfare," observed McNair dryly. "Not yet," Lucius agreed. "But public positions can evolve to meet public needs. Consider the political capital we could generate by becoming vocal advocates for magical children's rights. We could propose legislation ensuring that young witches and wizards are never again subjected to the kind of neglect Potter experienced." Narcissa found herself grudgingly impressed by her husband's strategy. By positioning themselves as champions of children like Harry Potter, they could rehabilitate their family's reputation while simultaneously gaining access to the most influential young wizard of their generation. "It's an interesting approach," she said, speaking for the first time that evening. "But it would require considerable finesse. Potter's supporters would be naturally suspicious of our motives, particularly given our families' previous associations." The euphemism hung in the air like incense. Everyone present understood that she was referring to the Dark Lord's rise and fall, and the various compromises and allegiances that had shaped their community during those turbulent years. Which is precisely why our approach must be genuine in appearance and substantial in action, Lucius said. "We're not talking about empty gestures or political theatre. We're talking about meaningful reform that addresses real problems in our society." "And Potter?" asked McNair. "What guarantee do we have that he'll be receptive to our involvement?" "Children are remarkably adaptable," Lucius said. "Potter may be suspicious now, but sustained exposure to genuine efforts on behalf of children like himself will inevitably soften his resistance. And Draco is perfectly positioned to facilitate those initial connections." Narcissa thought of her most recent letter from Draco, in which he had complained bitterly about Potter's continued friendship with Ron Weasley and Hermione Granger. Her son seemed to view Potter's loyalty to his friends as a personal affront, a rejection of the natural order that should have seen the famous Harry Potter gravitating toward more suitable companions. "Speaking of connections," she said carefully, "there's another dimension to consider. My sister Bellatrix remains imprisoned in Azkaban, along with several other members of our extended circle. Potter's influence might eventually extend to questions of justice and mercy for those who were misguided during the war." The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Several of the families present had lost members to Azkaban, and the prospect of eventually securing their release was never far from their thoughts. "An excellent point," Lucius said, his eyes glittering with approval at his wife's contribution. "Potter's story has already demonstrated the power of redemptive narratives. A boy who suffered and overcame, who chose mercy over vengeance, would be uniquely positioned to advocate for second chances for others." "Assuming he could be convinced to do so," McNair pointed out. "Assuming we give him reasons to value our support and friendship," Lucius corrected. "This is a long-term strategy, not a quick manipulation. We're talking about building genuine relationships, providing real value, earning trust through consistent action." As the evening progressed and the guests began to depart, Narcissa found herself reflecting on the ambitious scope of her husband's plans. The idea of rebuilding their family's influence through association with Harry Potter was audacious, but it also carried considerable risks. Potter had already shown himself capable of exposing uncomfortable truths, and any attempt to manipulate him could backfire spectacularly. Later, as she and Lucius prepared for bed in their private chambers, she voiced her concerns. "You're playing a dangerous game," she said, watching her husband's reflection in the ornate mirror of her dressing table. "Potter may be young, but he's not naive. His letter to the newspapers showed considerable sophistication in understanding how to present his story for maximum impact." "Which is exactly why he could be such a valuable ally," Lucius replied, settling into the chair beside her vanity. "Narcissa, we have an opportunity to align ourselves with the most influential young wizard of our generation. Done properly, this association could restore our family's standing and provide us with political leverage we haven't enjoyed in years." "And if it goes wrong? If Potter sees through our efforts and publicly exposes them?" Lucius was quiet for a moment, his grey eyes thoughtful. "Then we'll have learned something valuable about underestimating our opponents," he said finally. "But I don't believe it will come to that. Potter wants to belong, to find his place in our world. We simply need to convince him that his place is among those who can appreciate and nurture his remarkable talents." Narcissa turned from the mirror to study her husband's face directly. "And Draco? How does our son fit into these plans?" "Draco will learn what we all must learn, that power comes in many forms, and the wise recognize and adapt to changing circumstances. His initial approach to Potter was clumsy, based on assumptions about how influence works in our world. He'll need to develop more sophisticated strategies." As she prepared for sleep, Narcissa found herself thinking about the children at Hogwarts, her son Draco, struggling to understand why his traditional advantages seemed meaningless to Harry Potter. Potter himself, navigating a world of political undercurrents he likely didn't even recognize. And all the other young witches and wizards who were watching this drama unfold and learning lessons about power, influence, and loyalty that would shape their adult lives. The game her husband had initiated would play out over years, not months. Success would require patience, genuine value creation, and a level of strategic thinking that extended far beyond the crude power plays that had characterized their society during the war years. But as she finally settled into sleep, Narcissa couldn't shake the feeling that they were underestimating Harry Potter in fundamental ways. A child who could orchestrate his own rescue through a carefully crafted public appeal was not likely to be easily manipulated by adults, no matter how sophisticated their approach. The Malfoy family had survived worse miscalculations, but they had also learned that 11-year-old boys could sometimes surprise even the most experienced political operators. The question was whether they could adapt their strategy quickly enough to stay ahead of a remarkably precocious child who had already demonstrated an uncomfortable talent for exposing the gap between public personas and private realities. The discovery came quite by accident during a particularly boring history of magic lesson in early December. Professor Binns was droning on about the goblin rebellions of the 18th century when Hermione, who had been taking characteristically detailed notes, suddenly stopped writing and stared at her parchment with an expression of startled realization. "Harry," she whispered, glancing around to make sure Professor Binns was still absorbed in his lecture about goblin mining rights. "I think I've found something important." Harry looked up from where he had been attempting to stay awake by sketching Quidditch plays in the margins of his textbook. "What kind of something?" "About your case. About the people involved in your parents' deaths." Hermione's voice was barely audible, but her eyes were bright with the intensity that always accompanied her discoveries. "I've been researching pure-blood family histories for my essay on wizarding genealogy, and I found some connections I don't think anyone's talked about." Ron, who had been openly dozing at his desk, jerked awake at the mention of Harry's parents. "What kind of connections?" "The Black family," Hermione said, carefully sliding her research notes toward them under cover of her history textbook. "They're one of the oldest pure-blood families in Britain, and they have connections to almost everyone involved in what happened to your parents, Harry." Harry felt a familiar chill at the mention of his parents' deaths. Even months after learning the truth about how James and Lily Potter had really died, discussions of that night still made his stomach clench with a mixture of grief and anger. "What do you mean, connections?" he asked quietly. "Well," Hermione began, consulting her meticulously organized notes. "The Black family tree shows 3 sisters born in the 1950s, Bellatrix, Andromeda, and Narcissa. Narcissa married Lucius Malfoy. That's Draco's mother. Bellatrix married Rodolphus Lestrange and became one of you-know-who's most devoted followers. She's currently imprisoned in Azkaban for torturing the Longbottoms into madness." Harry's blood went cold. "Neville's parents?" "Yes," Hermione said grimly. "But there's more. The middle sister, Andromeda, was disowned by her family for marrying a Muggle-born wizard named Ted Tonks. She's apparently the only black sister who didn't follow the pure-blood supremacist ideology. "That's interesting and all," Ron said. "But what does any of this have to do with Harry's parents?" Hermione took a deep breath before continuing. "Because there's another black family member who's central to the whole story. Sirius Black, Bellatrix, and Narcissa's cousin. He's the one who's supposedly responsible for betraying Harry's parents to you-know-who." The words hit Harry like a physical blow. For months, he had known that someone had betrayed his parents' location to Voldemort, but he had never learned the specific details about who or how. Sirius Black betrayed them. "According to every account I can find, yes," Hermione said, her voice heavy with sympathy. "He was apparently your father's best friend, the person they trusted most. Your parents made him their secret keeper, which means he was the only person who could reveal their location. When you-know-who found them at Godric's Hollow, everyone assumed Sirius Black had given them up." Harry stared at the parchment in front of him, without really seeing it. The idea that his parents had been betrayed by their closest friend added another layer of horror to an already tragic story. "Where is he now?" "Azkaban," Ron said grimly. "The wizard prison. He's been there since right after your parents died." "But here's what's interesting," Hermione continued, her voice taking on the tone she used when she had discovered something particularly significant. "I've been reading about the trials that followed you-know-who's defeat, and there's something odd about Sirius Black's case." "Odd how?" Harry asked. "He never received a trial." The silence that followed was broken only by Professor Binns's monotonous voice continuing his lecture about goblin metalwork techniques. Harry felt something cold and hard settle in his chest as he processed Hermione's words. "What do you mean, he never received a trial?" "I mean exactly that," Hermione said, pulling out another set of notes. "I've been through the Ministry records for every Death Eater trial conducted after the war. Bellatrix Lestrange received a trial, as did Rodolphus Lestrange, and dozens of others. They were all given the opportunity to present evidence, to have legal representation, to appeal their sentences. But Sirius Black was simply arrested and sent to Azkaban without any formal legal proceedings." Ron looked confused. "But why would they skip a trial if he was obviously guilty?" "That's what I can't figure out," Hermione admitted. "Even the most obviously guilty Death Eaters received trials. It's required by wizarding law. The only explanation I can think of is that the evidence against Sirius Black was so overwhelming that the Ministry felt a trial would be unnecessary." Harry felt a strange mixture of anger and unease building in his chest. Or maybe there was something about his case that they didn't want examined too closely. "What do you mean?" Ron asked. "I don't know," Harry said slowly. "But Hermione's right. It is odd. If someone betrays Harry Potter's parents to you-know-who, wouldn't the Ministry want a very public trial to show they were bringing the traitor to justice? Wouldn't they want everyone to see that the person responsible was being properly punished?" Hermione nodded thoughtfully. "That's actually a very good point. The Ministry's handling of Death Eater trials was usually quite public, especially for high-profile cases. Skipping Sirius Black's trial seems irregular." "Maybe we could find out more," Harry suggested, surprising himself with his boldness. "About what really happened, I mean. About why he didn't get a trial." "How?" Ron asked practically. Hermione's eyes lit up with the enthusiasm of someone presented with a research challenge. "Well, there are several approaches we could take. We could request access to Ministry records, though as students that might be difficult. We could interview people who were involved in the investigation, or—" She paused, consulting her notes again. "We could try to speak with Andromeda Tonks." "The disowned sister?" Harry asked. "Think about it," Hermione explained. "She knew Sirius Black personally. They were cousins, after all. She would have known about his relationship with your father, about his character, about whether he was the type of person who would commit such a betrayal. And unlike her sisters, she's not in Azkaban, so she's actually accessible." "Would she be willing to talk to us?" Ron wondered. "I don't know," Hermione admitted. "But according to what I've read, she was cast out of the Black family, specifically because she rejected their pure blood ideology. If anyone would be willing to speak honestly about what happened, it would probably be her." Harry found himself staring out the window at the snow-covered grounds of Hogwarts, his mind racing with possibilities. For months, he had been focused on adjusting to life at school, dealing with his newfound fame, and learning to navigate the complex social dynamics of the wizarding world. But now, suddenly, he was faced with the prospect of investigating the circumstances of his parents' deaths. "There's something else," Hermione said quietly, apparently reading his expression. "If Sirius Black really was innocent, if he didn't betray your parents, then that means the real traitor was never caught." The implication hung in the air between them like a curse. Harry felt his hands begin to tremble slightly as he considered what Hermione was suggesting. "You're saying that whoever really killed my parents might still be free." "I'm saying that the official version of events might not be the complete truth," Hermione replied carefully. "And given everything that's happened to you, given how the Ministry handled your situation with the Dursleys, I think it's worth questioning whether their handling of your parents' case was as thorough as it should have been." Professor Binns continued his lecture, oblivious to the drama playing out among his students. Around them, other first-years dozed or doodled, completely unaware that Harry Potter was learning information that could potentially reshape his understanding of his parents' deaths. "What do we do?" Harry asked finally. "We research," Hermione said with characteristic determination. "We gather information, we ask questions, and we try to piece together what really happened that night. If Sirius Black is innocent, then he deserves justice. And if he's guilty, then at least we'll know the truth." "And if we find out the Ministry made a mistake?" Ron asked. "If they imprisoned an innocent man for 10 years without a trial?" Harry thought about his own experiences with the Ministry, about their failure to protect him from the Dursleys, about their panicked response when his story became public. Then it won't be the first time the Ministry has failed to protect someone who needed their help. As the class finally ended and students began filing out of the History of Magic classroom, Harry felt a new sense of purpose settling over him. For months, he had been focused on understanding his present circumstances, his life at Hogwarts, his friendships, his place in the wizarding world. But now he realized that truly understanding his present meant confronting the mysteries of his past. "Hermione," he said, as they gathered their books and prepared to leave, "can you find out how to contact Andromeda Tonks?" "I can try," she replied, "though it might take some time to locate her, and even longer to convince her to speak with us." "That's all right," Harry said. "I've waited 11 years to learn the truth about my parents. I can wait a little longer." But even as he spoke, Harry felt an urgency building within him. The discovery of potential irregularities in Sirius Black's case had opened a door to questions he hadn't even known existed. And beyond that door lay the possibility that everything he thought he knew about his parents' deaths was incomplete or even wrong. As they walked through the corridors of Hogwarts toward their next class, Harry found himself thinking about justice, about truth, and about the responsibility that came with being famous enough to ask difficult questions that others might prefer to leave unexamined. The Black family connections had revealed more than just genealogical curiosities. They had revealed the possibility that the wizarding world's most famous tragedy might not be the complete story that everyone believed it to be. Chapter 12. The revelation about the Black family connections had consumed Harry's thoughts for 3 days before he finally worked up the courage to approach Professor McGonagall. He found her in her office on Thursday evening, grading first-year transfiguration essays with the kind of focused intensity that suggested several students were about to receive unwelcome surprises about their academic performance. "Professor McGonagall," Harry said quietly from the doorway, his hand still resting on the brass doorknob. "Could I speak with you about something? It's about my family." McGonagall looked up from a particularly creative attempt to transform a match into a needle that had apparently resulted in something resembling a small, angry porcupine. Her expression shifted immediately from professional educator to something warmer and more concerned as she set down her quill. "Of course, Mr. Potter. Please come in and close the door." Harry did as instructed, then took the seat across from her desk that had become disturbingly familiar over the past few months. Ever since his story had become public knowledge, he had found himself in various professors' offices more often than he would have liked, usually for conversations about his adjustment to his new circumstances. "Professor," Harry began carefully, "Hermione and I have been researching something, and we discovered that my mother was related to the Black family, specifically to someone named Sirius Black." The effect on Professor McGonagall was immediate and dramatic. Her face went completely pale, and for a moment she looked as though someone had struck her. The quill in her hand snapped with a sharp crack that seemed unnaturally loud in the suddenly quiet office. "Where?" she said slowly. "Did you learn that name?" The tone in her voice made Harry's stomach clench with sudden apprehension. This was not the reaction of someone hearing a mildly interesting genealogical fact. This was the reaction of someone hearing something that changed everything. "We were researching family connections for a history of magic project," Harry said, which was close enough to the truth to avoid being an outright lie. "We found records showing that my mother's family tree connected to the Black family, and that there was a Sirius Black who was supposedly involved with what happened to my parents." McGonagall stood abruptly, moving to the window that overlooked the grounds. For a long moment she said nothing, simply staring out at the darkening sky as if searching for answers in the winter twilight. "Mr. Potter," she said finally, "what exactly have you learned about Sirius Black?" "Not much," Harry admitted. "Just that he was connected to my parents somehow, and that he's in Azkaban for betraying them to Voldemort." Harry caught himself on the name, still not quite comfortable saying it aloud, despite everything he had already faced. McGonagall turned back to face him, and Harry was startled to see what looked like tears in her eyes. "Professor, what aren't you telling me?" McGonagall returned to her desk, but did not sit down. Instead, she opened one of the lower drawers and withdrew a file that looked official and important. Harry could see the ministry seal on the cover, even from his position across the desk. "Mr. Potter, there are aspects of your family's history that have been carefully managed since you came to live with your relatives. The ministry felt it was in your best interest to shield you from certain painful truths until you were older and better able to process them." "What kind of truths?" McGonagall opened the file and withdrew a photograph. She hesitated for a moment, then turned it toward Harry. The photograph showed 4 young people, probably around 17 or 18 years old, standing together outside what Harry recognized as the entrance to Hogwarts. Two of them he recognized immediately, his parents, looking impossibly young and happy. The third was a boy with messy black hair that reminded Harry painfully of his own, wearing an expression of mischievous joy that seemed to light up his entire face. The fourth person in the photograph made Harry's breath catch in his throat. It was a man he had seen before, though not in person. Sirius Black, but decades younger, his arm thrown casually around James Potter's shoulders as they both laughed at something outside the frame. "Sirius Black," McGonagall said quietly, "was your father's best friend. They were closer than brothers. Sirius was your godfather, Mr. Potter." The words hit Harry like a physical blow. He stared at the photograph, trying to process what he was seeing. The young man in the picture looked nothing like the dangerous criminal he had imagined. He looked like someone who belonged with his parents, someone who was part of their world in a way that spoke of years of friendship and trust. But he betrayed them. He told Voldemort where to find them. "That," said McGonagall heavily, "is what everyone believed. What everyone still believes." Something in her tone made Harry look up sharply. "What do you mean?" McGonagall closed the file and returned it to the drawer, but she kept the photograph on the desk between them. "Mr. Potter, your public revelation about your treatment at the hands of your relatives has forced many of us to re-examine assumptions we had made about your welfare and about the decisions that were made on your behalf. Some of us have begun to wonder if there might be other assumptions that deserve re-examination as well." Harry felt as though the ground was shifting beneath his feet. "You think he might be innocent?" "I think," McGonagall said carefully, "that a man who loved your parents enough to be chosen as your godfather, who was willing to risk everything for them during the war, deserves to have his case examined with the same thoroughness that we now wish we had applied to your own situation." Harry picked up the photograph with trembling hands. Now that he looked closer, he could see something in Sirius Black's face that he had missed before, a fierce protectiveness in the way he looked at Harry's parents, particularly at his mother. This was not the face of someone who would betray the people he loved. What would it mean if he was innocent? McGonagall was quiet for a long moment. "It would mean that your godfather has spent 11 years in Azkaban for a crime he did not commit. It would mean that you have been denied the family member who was specifically chosen to care for you if something happened to your parents. It would mean that whoever actually betrayed your parents is still free." The implications crashed over Harry in waves. If Sirius Black was innocent, then everything about Harry's story was even more tragic than anyone had realized. Not only had he been placed with abusive relatives instead of loving, magical guardians, but the person who should have been caring for him had been rotting in prison for a crime he hadn't committed. "Professor," Harry said slowly, "if there's a chance that he's innocent, then we have to do something about it." "Mr. Potter," McGonagall said firmly, "this is not a matter for an 11-year-old boy to involve himself in, no matter how remarkable that boy might be. This is a matter for the proper authorities." "The proper authorities?" Harry pointed out with a bitter edge to his voice that surprised even him. "Are the same people who left me with the Dursleys for 10 years without checking on me even once. Forgive me if I don't have complete faith in their ability to handle this properly." McGonagall winced, and Harry immediately regretted the harshness of his words. But he couldn't take them back, and he wasn't sure he wanted to. "What you're suggesting," McGonagall said after a moment, "would require a formal review of the case. It would mean challenging a conviction that was handed down during a time when everyone was desperate for justice and closure. It would mean admitting that the entire wizarding justice system failed catastrophically." "Yes," Harry said simply. "It would." McGonagall studied his face for a long moment. Harry met her gaze steadily, trying to convey with his expression everything he couldn't quite put into words. He had already upended the wizarding world once by refusing to stay silent about injustice. If there was another injustice that needed addressing, he wasn't going to turn away from it, just because it was complicated or difficult. "Mr. Potter," McGonagall said finally, "what you accomplished with your letter to the newspapers was remarkable. But it was also dangerous. You forced the entire wizarding world to confront uncomfortable truths about itself, and while the results have largely been positive for you, that kind of upheaval always comes with risks." "What kind of risks?" "The kind that come when powerful people are forced to admit they were wrong about something important. Your situation with the Dursleys has already caused significant political embarrassment for the Ministry. If it were to come out that they also wrongly imprisoned an innocent man for 11 years... She didn't need to finish the thought. Harry could imagine the kind of chaos that would follow. The Ministry was already struggling to maintain credibility in the wake of the revelations about Harry's treatment. Another major failure of justice could potentially bring down the entire government. "So what do you think I should do?" McGonagall considered this for a long moment. "I think," she said slowly, "that you should continue to be the remarkable young man you have already proven yourself to be. But I also think you should remember that you are still 11 years old, and that some battles require allies with more experience and resources than you currently possess." "You mean I should tell someone else about this and let them handle it?" "I mean, you should be very careful about who you trust with information this sensitive, and you should think carefully about the consequences before you act." She paused. "But I also mean that if Sirius Black is indeed innocent, then he deserves justice, regardless of how politically inconvenient that justice might be." Harry nodded slowly, understanding the subtext. McGonagall couldn't officially encourage him to investigate this further, but she wasn't telling him not to, either. "Professor, if I wanted to learn more about what actually happened that night when my parents died, where would I start?" McGonagall hesitated, then opened the drawer again and withdrew a small piece of parchment. "The person who was responsible for investigating your parents' deaths was Barty Crouch Sr., who was then head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. However, that investigation was conducted during a time of great turmoil, and there were pressures to resolve cases quickly." She wrote something on the parchment and handed it to Harry. "This is the name of someone who might be able to help you understand what questions were asked during that investigation, and what questions perhaps should have been asked but weren't." Harry looked at the parchment. Written in McGonagall's precise handwriting was a single name: Amelia Bones. Department of Magical Law Enforcement. "She's someone who can be trusted." "She's someone who believes in justice more than politics," McGonagall said, which Harry took as a strong endorsement. Harry folded the parchment and put it in his pocket. As he stood to leave, McGonagall called his name. "Mr. Potter, I want you to understand something. Your letter to the newspapers accomplished something truly extraordinary. It forced people to confront the gap between what they claimed to believe about protecting children and what they actually did about it. If you choose to pursue this matter further, you may find yourself once again in the position of forcing people to confront uncomfortable truths about justice and accountability. And you think I should be prepared for that?" "I think," McGonagall said quietly, "that the wizarding world has been fortunate to have someone willing to ask difficult questions when everyone else was content to look the other way. But I also think that the more often you ask those questions, the more people will expect you to have the answers as well. Harry nodded, understanding the weight of what she was telling him. His letter had made him famous, but it had also made him a symbol of something larger than himself. If he chose to challenge Sirius Black's conviction, he wouldn't just be trying to free an innocent man, he would be challenging the entire system of justice that had condemned him. As Harry walked back to Gryffindor Tower through the dimly lit corridors of Hogwarts, he found himself thinking about the photograph McGonagall had shown him. Sirius Black's face had been so full of life and joy, so different from the hollow-eyed prisoner he had undoubtedly become after 11 years in Azkaban. If Sirius Black was innocent, and Harry was increasingly convinced that he was, then Harry's story wasn't just about surviving abuse or fighting for justice. It was about family, and about the people who should have been there to protect him, but had been prevented from doing so by a system that was too quick to assume guilt and too slow to question its own mistakes. Harry had spent 10 years believing he was alone in the world. The possibility that he had a godfather who had been wrongly imprisoned for trying to protect his parents was almost too much to process. But if there was even a chance that Sirius Black was innocent, then Harry owed it to himself, to his parents, and to Sirius to find out the truth. The wizarding world had already learned that Harry Potter was not content to remain silent about injustice. Now they were about to learn that he wasn't content to leave mysteries unsolved either. As he climbed through the portrait hole into the Gryffindor common room, Harry was already planning his next move. He had a name now, and a direction to pursue. Amelia Bones might be able to help him understand what had really happened the night his parents died. And if she couldn't, or wouldn't, then Harry would find someone who could. Because if there was one thing his first few months as a public figure had taught him, it was that sometimes the most important truths were the ones that powerful people least wanted to hear. He just hoped that this time, when he finally learned the truth, he would be strong enough to handle whatever consequences came with it. The letter arrived during breakfast 3 days after Harry's conversation with Hermione about the Black family connections. It came with the regular morning post, carried by a large barn owl, that landed directly in front of Harry's plate with the kind of precision that suggested official business. The envelope bore the Ministry of Magic seal, and Harry's name was written across it in formal script that made his stomach clench with familiar apprehension. Around him, the great hall buzzed with its usual morning energy. Students chatted over porridge and toast, comparing notes about upcoming exams and weekend plans. But as Harry stared at the letter, the normalcy felt suddenly fragile, like a soap bubble about to burst. "What is it?" Ron asked through a mouthful of bacon, though his expression suggested he already suspected this wasn't good news. Hermione leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Is it about what we discussed?" Harry broke the seal carefully, his hands steadier than he felt. The letter inside was brief and to the point, written on official ministry letterhead that carried the weight of governmental authority. "Mr. Potter, your inquiry regarding historical records pertaining to the Black family has been received by the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. Due to the sensitive nature of certain aspects of this case, we request your presence for a brief consultation at your earliest convenience. Please present yourself to the Ministry at 2 o'clock this afternoon. Use the visitor's entrance and ask for Aura Kingsley Shacklebolt, who will escort you to the appropriate department. Yours sincerely, Amelia Bones, Head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement." Harry read the letter twice before handing it to Hermione, who scanned it quickly and then looked at him with a mixture of concern and curiosity. "You wrote to them about Sirius Black?" she asked quietly. "I sent an inquiry about family records," Harry said, which was technically true. After their research session, he had crafted what he hoped was a carefully neutral request for information about his family connections, particularly regarding any living relatives. He hadn't expected such a swift or official response. Ron leaned over to read the letter, his freckled face growing pale. "Bloody hell, Harry. They want to see you at the ministry? That's serious." The irony of Ron's choice of words wasn't lost on Harry, but he found he couldn't manage even a weak smile. The formal tone of the letter suggested this was more than a routine inquiry response. Someone at the ministry was taking his questions about the Black family very seriously indeed. Professor McGonagall appeared at his shoulder as if she had materialized from thin air, though Harry suspected she had been monitoring the owl post more carefully than usual since his story had become public knowledge. "Mr. Potter, might I have a word?" It wasn't really a question. Harry folded the letter and followed McGonagall to the head table, where she gestured for him to sit in an empty chair beside her own. "I received a flu call from the ministry this morning," she said, without preamble. "Amelia Bones wished to inform me that you had made certain inquiries about family records. She felt it would be appropriate for you to have a professor present during your consultation. You're coming with me? If you wish it. Ms. Bones was quite insistent that this matter be handled with proper care and consideration for your age and circumstances." McGonagall's expression was carefully neutral, but Harry could see the concern in her eyes. "She also mentioned that your inquiry had raised some questions that warranted discussion with you directly." Harry felt his pulse quicken. "What kind of questions?" "The kind that are best discussed in private, with proper safeguards in place." McGonagall's tone was gentle but firm. "Mr. Potter, when we spoke about certain family connections, I advised you to be careful about who you trusted with sensitive information. Ms. Bones is someone who can be trusted, but this consultation suggests that your inquiries may have uncovered something more significant than simple genealogical curiosity." The rest of the morning passed in a haze of distraction. Harry attempted to pay attention during transfiguration and potions, but his mind kept returning to the letter and what it might mean. Hermione and Ron flanked him like bodyguards, offering quiet support and asking no questions he wasn't ready to answer. When lunchtime arrived, Harry found he had no appetite. The thought of food made his stomach churn with nervous energy, and he pushed his shepherd's pie around his plate without taking a proper bite. "You don't have to do this alone," Hermione said quietly, as they prepared to leave for the afternoon. "Whatever they want to discuss, remember that you have people who support you. And if they try any ministry nonsense, you tell them where they can stuff it," Ron added, with characteristic bluntness that actually managed to make Harry smile. The journey to the ministry was accomplished via flu powder from McGonagall's office, a mode of transportation that Harry was still getting accustomed to. The spinning sensation and rush of green flames deposited them in the ministry atrium, with its gleaming golden fountain and bustling crowd of witches and wizards going about their daily business. Aura Kingsley Shacklebolt was waiting for them near the security desk, his imposing figure and calm demeanor immediately recognizable from Harry's previous encounters with ministry officials. He greeted them with professional courtesy and guided them through the maze of corridors that led to the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. Amelia Bones's office was larger and more formal than McGonagall's, with dark wood paneling and shelves lined with legal texts and case files. The woman herself was middle-aged, with graying hair and shrewd eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. She gestured for them to sit in comfortable chairs arranged around a small conference table rather than across from her desk, a gesture that Harry appreciated for its lack of intimidation. "Mr. Potter," she began. "First, Let me say that your inquiry was perfectly appropriate given your circumstances. You have every right to seek information about your family history, particularly regarding any living relatives who might have been available to care for you. Harry nodded, though he sensed there was a significant "however" coming. However, your specific questions about Sirius Black have brought to light some concerns about the handling of your guardianship arrangements following your parents' deaths, concerns that, frankly, should have been addressed years ago. She opened a file that had been sitting on the table and withdrew several documents. According to the records we have reviewed, Sirius Black was indeed named as your godfather by your parents. He was their chosen guardian in the event of their deaths. The words hit Harry like a physical blow, even though he had suspected this truth since his conversation with McGonagall. Hearing it confirmed officially made it real in a way that speculation could not. If he was my godfather, then why? Harry's voice trailed off, the question too large and painful to complete. Why were you placed with your relatives instead? Amelia Bones finished gently. That is precisely the question that your inquiry has forced us to confront. She withdrew another document from the file. The decision to place you with the Dursleys was made by Albus Dumbledore, acting in what he believed to be your best interests. At the time, Sirius Black was wanted for the murders of your parents and 12 Muggles. It was assumed that your godfather had betrayed your family to Voldemort. But what if he didn't? Harry asked, the question that had been burning in his mind finally finding voice. Amelia Bones was quiet for a long moment, her expression grave. Mr. Potter, that is a question that has significant implications for both your personal situation and for the integrity of our justice system. If Sirius Black is innocent of the crimes for which he was convicted, then not only has an innocent man spent 11 years in Azkaban, but you have been denied the family that your parents specifically chose for you. McGonagall leaned forward slightly. Ms. Bones, are you saying that there are doubts about Black's guilt? I am saying that your student's inquiry has prompted a review of the case files, and that review has revealed certain irregularities in the original investigation that warrant further examination. Amelia Bones chose her words carefully, but Harry could hear the undercurrent of concern in her voice. The investigation into the Potter murders was conducted during a time of great chaos and fear. Cases were resolved quickly, perhaps too quickly, in the interest of providing closure and justice for the victims. Harry felt as though the ground was shifting beneath his feet. What kind of irregularities? The kind that suggest the investigation may not have been as thorough as it should have been. The kind that raise questions about whether all the evidence was properly considered before a conviction was reached. The implications crashed over Harry in waves. If Sirius Black was innocent, then Harry's entire life had been built on a foundation of injustice. Not only had he suffered years of abuse with the Dursleys, but somewhere an innocent man was rotting in Azkaban for crimes he didn't commit, while the real traitor walked free. What happens now? Harry asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Now, said Amelia Bones, we conduct a proper investigation. We review the evidence with fresh eyes and without the pressure of wartime urgency. We ask the questions that should have been asked 11 years ago. She closed the file and looked directly at Harry. Mr. Potter, I want you to understand that this process may take considerable time, and there are no guarantees about what we will find. But I also want you to know that if there has been a miscarriage of justice, this department will not rest until it is corrected. Harry nodded, feeling overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was suggesting. Is there a way for me to help with the investigation? Your role in this should be simply to be a child, Mr. Potter. You have already done more than enough by asking the right questions. Let the adults handle the rest." But even as she said it, Harry could see in her eyes that she understood this was not just a legal matter for him. This was personal in the most fundamental way possible. This was about family and truth, and the possibility that the life he had been forced to live was the result of a catastrophic failure of justice. As they prepared to leave, Amelia Bones handed Harry a small card with her name and a special flu address written on it. "If you think of anything else, or if you have questions as this investigation proceeds, you can contact me directly." "And Mr. Potter?" She paused, her expression softening slightly. "Whatever we discover, please know that there are people working to ensure that justice is served, even when it comes later than it should have." The journey back to Hogwarts passed in contemplative silence. Harry stared out the windows of the ministry lift, and then into the green flames of the flue as they returned to McGonagall's office, his mind spinning with the possibilities that Amelia Bones had laid before him. If Sirius Black was innocent, then Harry might still have family in the world. Not the Dursleys who had made it clear that he was an unwelcome burden, but someone who had actually been chosen by his parents to love and care for him. Someone who might have wanted him. The thought was almost too precious to contemplate, wrapped as it was in the tragedy of 11 lost years. But beneath the pain, Harry felt something else stirring. Hope. Not just for himself, but for the possibility that truth could prevail, even when it was buried under years of assumption and fear. As evening settled over Hogwarts, Harry sat in the Gryffindor common room with Hermione and Ron, quietly sharing what he could of his conversation with Amelia Bones. The fire crackled in the grate, casting dancing shadows on the walls as students around them worked on homework and chatted about the ordinary concerns of 11-year-olds. But Harry's concerns were no longer ordinary, if they ever had been. He was no longer just the boy who lived, or even just the boy who had exposed his own abuse to save other children. He was now the boy who might inadvertently expose the failure of the entire wizarding justice system, and in doing so, perhaps save an innocent man who should have been his family all along. The weight of that responsibility settled on his shoulders like a familiar cloak, heavy but not unwelcome. Harry Potter had learned that sometimes asking difficult questions was the only way to find the truth, no matter how painful that truth might be. And if there was even a chance that Sirius Black was innocent, then asking those questions was not just Harry's right. It was his obligation to the family he might still have.